The piercing screams of women drowned out the toll of the alarm bell. The first blood spattered on the steps of the faceted chamber. This only enraged the rebels further, clearing their path with sharp spears and with poleaxes. And then they stormed into the palace. One of the ringleaders was still shouting out a list of unwanted boyars when dozens of drunken Streltsy rushed to search the interior rooms. They found many victims in the rooms and took many lives that day. It was a cruel and difficult time for the people they took, and not all of them survived. The Tsarina, Natalia Kirillovna, nearly fell victim to their rage, and only her son's intervention saved her from a blow with a battle axe.
Shut up, I said! Sit down! Come on, we're going to crush them. Glory and riches with the arm. Stop! Dad! You're going to die! Don't kill the kid! Yeah, and child! Take that!
The massacre lasted for 3 days. Before the eyes of the 10-year-old Tsar, the Streltsy tore apart his mother's brothers, as well as her close boyars. From that moment on, the Tsardom of Muscovy would forever remain for him, a symbol of savagery, chaos, and senseless cruelty. Years would pass and he would turn the life of an entire country upside down, changing the power structure, way of life, habits, and even the outward appearance of his subjects. He would go down in history as Peter the Great, and in place of Old Rus, he would build the Russian Empire. The state that was created by Peter would endure for 2 centuries. During this time, it would experience political upheavals and military triumphs, give birth to a great culture, and expand its territory to occupy 1/6 of the world's landmass. The Russian Empire would become home to more than 100 peoples, gain fame for its scientists and diplomats, musicians, artists, and entrepreneurs. And even during Peter's lifetime, it would join the ranks of the world's leading powers, a force to be reckoned with. In 1682, after the death of Tsar Fyodor Alexeyevich, who left no direct heir, a political crisis erupted in Moscow. And what a crisis it was. It reached its climax during the bloody Streltsy Uprising, and was only resolved after the convening of the Zemsky Sobor. As a result, 2 brothers were crowned at once, 10-year-old Peter and 15-year-old Ivan. Until they came of age, the country was ruled by their older sister, Tsarevna Sophia. She was a highly educated, intelligent, and power-hungry woman. Peter and his mother, Natalia Kirillovna, moved to the village of Preobrazhenskoye near Moscow. The young Tsar was not known for his diligence, and church books bored him to tears. However, Peter couldn't tear himself away from colorful foreign publications. He hastily flipped through the pages, eagerly peering at images of fairy tale German cities that stoked his imagination. The unfamiliar life beckoned, seeming like an eternal celebration. But he was not in a fairy tale world.
By the early 1680s, the Russian Tsardom occupied a territory of 14.5 million square kilometers, with a population of about 11 million people. A small population for the territory. There was less than one person per square kilometer. The lands beyond the Urals remained almost uninhabited. While Moscow had 100,000 inhabitants, all of Siberia had no more than 20,000. At this time, France actually had twice the population, even though at least 20 Frances could fit within the territory of the Russian Tsardom, a major population difference.
Russia attracted neighboring lands very much like a magnet. Starting as a small Muscovite principality, it transformed into an empire before anyone even called it one. The annexation was far from always peaceful. But step by step, Russia merged with other countries and peoples, and before it knew it, it occupied 1/5 of the world's landmass. Different peoples, while remaining distinct, were willingly or unwillingly incorporated into the common state and cultural construction. They quarreled with each other and with the authorities, rebelled, and made demands. The authorities suppressed rebellions for which they were disliked, but they were forced to listen to demands for which they were respected. Meanwhile, the peoples and states of Europe existed in extremely cramped and crowded conditions. Large states butted up against each other's borders, nibbling away at their neighbors' territories, but without fundamentally changing the balance of power. With scarce resources, survival here was possible only by developing technologies and science, knowledge, and skills. In Western Europe, people learned to value both the land and its resources. The great geographical discoveries and the seizure of overseas colonies with their immense wealth further propelled economic growth. This was then followed by the creation of modern political institutions.
Tsar Fyodor Alexeyevich, Peter I's elder brother, anticipated many Western-style reforms. He conducted a general census, introduced unified taxation, abolished the custom of mesnichestvo, which is appointment to positions based on ancestry, and finally he approved the plan for Moscow University. There were plans to introduce a unified system of state ranks and publish the first history of Russia. But Tsar Fyodor died young, and the regent Sophia acted cautiously, always looking over her shoulder at her entourage.
Nevertheless, Moscow society was changing, albeit slowly. European weapons, ammunition, clocks, and carriages were being imported into the country. Nobility from Poland, Little Russia, Ukraine, and Lithuania were being hired for service. New customs, language, and clothing were coming into fashion. Many nobles preferred the Polish kontusz to the old-fashioned kaftan, which was originally Eastern attire, as were the boyars' fur hats and peasants' armyaks, the influence of the West. However, the East still exerted as much influence on Muscovy as the West did.
Take a look. Have a look.
As Peter grew up, he spent more and more time with his peers. Soon, the boyish games of playing with toy soldiers turned into a serious pursuit. The toy regiments, armed, trained, and dressed in a foreign manner, under the command of the young Tsar, were turning into a real military force. Peter's intense activities seriously frightened Tsarevna Sophia. She clung tightly to power and had no intention of sharing it with anyone. At her instigation, rumors began to circulate in the capital that the younger Tsar was acting strangely, and he shouldn't be allowed to rule the state. Meanwhile, Peter was entering his 17th year, the perfect time to look for a bride.
Hold it.
After considering
All right,
several
that's good.
options,
Looks good.
Natalia
Let's go.
Kirillovna settled on Eudoxia Lopukina, a girl from a family that, though impoverished, was a large one and was very loyal to their family.
Where are you going? Stay where you are.
The Tsar didn't object. Let everyone see. He is already an adult. Months passed, and Eudoxia was expecting their firstborn. But the young husband felt confined in the cozy family nest. There, far from the royal chambers, on the free banks of the Yauza River, reckless friends and new plans awaited him. And his wife increasingly found herself spending long summer evenings alone. Meanwhile, the capital was shaken by terrible news. Allegedly, Peter had decided to storm the Kremlin with his toy troops, kill his elder sister, along with his brother Ivan, and become the sole ruler. Sophia, who had spread this rumor herself, demanded that the Streltsy stand in her defense, and that Peter be deposed and arrested.
The conflict between Sophia and Peter boiled down to a power struggle between two aristocratic clans. Both of the sides were betting on a strong and special alliance with Western powers. Sophia and her entourage were oriented towards both Catholic Poland and Austria. A victory for the Tsarevna would have led to an increase in the influence of the Papal Church. All of this could have sparked extensive religious conflicts in Orthodox Russia, or even a civil war. Peter, on the other hand, would choose Protestant countries as his model, the Netherlands, Germany, and England. His subsequent reforms did little to align with the Orthodox view of the country's future, introducing a spirit of materialism. However, despite the upheavals associated with Peter's vast reforms, Russia avoided religious wars.
Peter Alexeyevich, sovereign of all Great, Little, and White Russia, couldn't shake off his extreme anxiety. Upon learning that his sister was rallying the Streltsy against him, he fled here to the Trinity Lavra of St. Sergius. Peter tried to convince himself this wasn't cowardice. Any reasonable person would have done the same, but there was a rumbling in his ears. Now much had changed. He was the Tsar. By his order, the entire court and the toy regiments had already moved to the Trinity Lavra of St. Sergius. But would the Moscow regiments obey him? If they chose Sophia's side, then blood would be shed again, as in his childhood. But this time, not of the boyars close to him, but of Peter himself. Fear wouldn't let go, gripping his heart with an icy hand. And then, Colonel Franz Jacob Lefort arrived. He brought good news. Moscow was supporting Peter fully, and the sovereign had nothing to fear.
Franz Lefort, a native of the Free City of Geneva, grew up in the family of a successful merchant, but despised his father's occupation and dreamed of a military career. At the age of 18, against his family's wishes, he set off for distant Russia, where he entered military service under Tsar Fyodor Alexeyevich. During the de facto rule of Tsarevna Sophia, he rose to the rank of colonel. In August 1689, when conflict erupted between Sophia and her younger brother, Lefort unequivocally took the side of the legitimate Tsar, Peter.
The Moscow regiment siding with Peter proved decisive in the struggle against Sophia. It didn't even come to a direct military confrontation. The Tsarevna was confined to the Novodevichi convent, while the sickly Ivan voluntarily handed over all power to his younger brother, formally remaining his co-ruler. However, young Peter remained indifferent to matters of state governance. So for several more years, the most important decisions were made by his mother, Natalia Kirillovna's inner circle. In February of 1690, Peter and Evdokia had a newborn son. The heir was named after his grandfather, Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich. But Peter's joy at this news was short-lived. Having completely lost interest in his wife, he spent more and more time with his new friend Franz Lefort. It was at Lefort's invitation that Peter, upon returning to Moscow, ventured into the German quarter, where no Russian ruler had ever set foot before.
The German quarter, or Kukui, was a district for immigrants from Germany, England, and Holland, located outside Moscow proper. In Russia, foreigners were viewed with suspicion. They were called Germans, meaning mute, those who couldn't speak Russian. Alongside experienced officers and craftsmen, one could find misfits and adventurers here. In Moscow, the quarter was considered a den of heresy and debauchery due to its abundance of distilleries and raucous celebrations.
The amiable Franz rushed down the stairs to greet me. No bowing or, heaven forbid, prostrating oneself on the ground. He simply said,
Oh, Peter,
"Oh, Peter,
I'm
how
so
happy I am.
I can't believe my eyes.
I cannot believe
You're
my
guest."
eyes. You are my guest." And you could tell he wasn't lying. The French caftan mercilessly chafed under his arms. His head itched terribly beneath the wig, but Peter was happy. Everything here was unfamiliar, unusual, noisy, and very merry. More intoxicating than the wine was the proximity of women in low-cut dresses with towering hairstyles. Lefort whispered in his ear, "Introducing Miss Anna Mons." Peter froze. Before him stood the beautiful maiden from his childhood dreams.
According to Russian tradition, interaction between men and women outside the family was severely restricted. At feasts, except for weddings, women did not sit at the common table. In peasant families, men ate first, then women. In wealthy homes, there were separate meals in different parts of the house, male and female quarters. The customs of the German quarter, where both sexes interacted as equals, not only shocked Moscow's residents, but also seemed provocative and immoral to them.
Anna Mons captivated Peter with her free-spirited manner and cheerful disposition, uncommon for Russian girls. She was the youngest daughter of Johann Georg Mons, a native of Westphalia who had moved to Moscow in the mid-17th century, and, as a master goldsmith, he had amassed a considerable fortune here. Many contemporaries noted Anna Mons's exceptional beauty, though detractors claimed that they were not truthful and simply attempting to flatter the Tsar. In any case, no portraits of her have survived. The Tsar became a frequent visitor to the German quarter. And here, amidst dances and fireworks, the first plans for future reforms were born. Peter understood. Russia desperately needed knowledge, skills, and technology, things that it was sadly short on. After the death of his brother Ivan and mother Natalia Kirillovna, he became the sole ruler and now intended to transform the entire nation. But where to start? Lefort suggested that Peter should see how European countries usually lived. Thus, the idea of the Grand Embassy was born.
The official purpose of the Grand Embassy was to find allies for the war against the Turks. The unofficial goal was to become acquainted with European culture and technologies. The embassy was led by Franz Lefort, Fyodor Golovin, and Duma clerk Prokofy Voznitsin as well. The Tsar himself embarked on the journey incognito, under the name of Foreman Pyotr Mikhailov.
At the tail of the huge ambassadorial convoy walked 36 young men. They were volunteers from among the Tsar's Petsashny, and they were going to Europe to study shipbuilding, a profession that was in high demand at that time. And in one of them, as long as a pole, the Muscovites, not believing their eyes, suddenly recognized the Tsar himself. A foolish man jumped out of somewhere, shouting in a loud voice, "The sovereign has gone to the Germans. Repent, brethren, for the end times have come." Peter walked the streets. He wore the clothes of a Dutch sailor. And he was doing the unthinkable. He was working. He loved manual labor. And throughout his life, he was always eager to learn new trades. He forged anchors, made paper, worked on a lathe, tore the teeth of courtiers, and sometimes took up the surgeon's scalpel. Once he worked for several hours in a row in the smelting shop, making 18 poods of iron, for which he received 18 altin. He loved to work. With this money, he immediately bought himself new clogs, and was pleased to show them to everyone, saying that he had earned them by his own labor. In Europe, Peter went to the Dutch shipyards, doing carpentry first in Zaandam and later on in Amsterdam. In his spare time, he examined collections of minerals, coins, weapons, and archaeological finds. Picture galleries and theaters did not interest him, with the exception of Professor Frederick Ruysch's Anatomical Theater, which he found fascinating. Peter bought the anatomical collection of Ruysch, and on its basis created the first Russian museum, Kunstkamera. Admission to the museum was free, and visitors were treated to coffee, zuckerbrodas, that is cakes, and Hungarian wine. Wine especially attracted men, and they entered the Kunstkamera several times, remaining completely indifferent to the collection itself. From Amsterdam, Peter continued on to London. And it was there that he decided to take up the study of both British industry and government. He met Isaac Newton, and he even tried to lure Newton into the Russian service, though he was unsuccessful at that.
One of the tasks of the Great Embassy was to recruit specialists, primarily for the Army and Navy. The first batch of mercenaries numbered exactly 672 people. Weapons, tools, and materials were purchased for the Army and Navy, and for Peter's personal household, mathematical, medical, drawing tools, medicines, books, several live parrots, one monkey, as well as 2 stuffed animals, crocodile and swordfish.
Every day, a new wagon from Arkhangelsk. They're bringing dried lizards, and the Streltsy have not been paid their wages for 6 months. It was said that the musketeer Františka Lefort, by malice aforethought, persuaded the Tsar to go to the Germans, so that there he could be drugged with a potion and replaced. And now they say, Tsar Peter sits in prison. Instead of him will soon appear in Moscow a German blackmonger, or even the Antichrist himself. Peter was more enthusiastic than ever, and Franz from Amsterdam wrote letters to the sovereign several times a day. This is the ruler that Russia needs. Now this country, vast and rich, is blocked off by the frequent fences of age-old prejudices. But Peter has the determination to break down all that is superfluous and to build that which is necessary. From London, Peter and his retinue traveled to Vienna. And the owner of the house, which was rented to the Russian Tsar, has asked the British government to compensate for the damage. It was valued at the enormous sum of £320, a lot for the time. Meanwhile, bad news came from Moscow. The Streltsy rebelled. Trouble was brewing. 4 Streltsy regiments marched to Moscow to burn the Nemetskaya Sloboda, to exterminate Peter's supporters, and to put his sister Sophia on the throne. The riot letter went on for a month. What had happened in Moscow in the meantime, and who had gained the upper hand, he did not know. The king was convulsed with hatred and fear. Never had Lefort seen Peter like this. There, in Moscow, the hated Sophia again called the Streltsy to kill him and trample everything that was dear to him. His friends, his love, his dream, everything in his life. They rushed home day and night, stopping only for lunch and for a change of horses. It was frightening to look at the king. He had not slept for 4 days. Lefort didn't understand how he wasn't falling. Peter accepted the mail from the messenger with shaking hands. From Moscow, they reported the uprising was suppressed. That was the end of it. 100 people executed. When Peter and his companions arrived in the capital on the evening of August 25th, He was not yet expected and therefore not welcomed. Without stopping at home, he went to the German quarter to see Anna Mons. No one recognized the Tsar. People on the streets recoiled in fear, and no wonder. The Peter who used to set off fireworks and dance with the beautiful Anshin was gone and would never return. The day after his arrival, the Tsar staged a demonstration in the Kremlin. 2 jesters cut off the boyars' beards with sheep shears. In Russia, a beard symbolized respectability as well as piety. But in Peter's eyes, it remained a symbol of patriarchal backwardness, which the Tsar intended to eradicate.
Peter left the right to wear a beard only to peasants and clergy, as well as those who would pay a beard tax. Rich merchants 100 rubles a year, service class and middle class merchants 60, and as for others, 30 rubles.
4 days after his return, Peter ordered the rioters to be brought to Preobrazhenskoye. There were 14 torture chambers there, and they operated around the clock. The Tsar was personally present during the interrogations. He spent his nights at feasts in the German quarter at Lefort's house. He behaved like a man possessed, and even those close to him feared him. A month later, the executions began, with the largest taking place on October 22nd. 200 Streltsy who were arrested were brought to the Red Square. Wives and children ran crying behind the carts. Execution blocks and gallows stood near the Kremlin wall. The role of executioners was assigned to the Tsar's associates. Only Lefort, among a few foreigners, managed to refuse. Evdokia burst into tears, begged, accused her husband of terrible cruelty. Only the worst of monsters could actually leave such a young son without a mother. Then she went to seek the Patriarch's intercession, and thereby angered Peter even more. His anger was terrible to behold indeed. This is the end. Alexei will be sent to Preobrazhenskoye. He will be put into the care of the Tsar's sister Natalia.
Mommy!
And now,
No!
the heir to the throne watched silently as the guards took his mother away to the monastery, to eternal confinement. And in his soul grew a helpless rage against his father. As for Anna Mons, she became Peter's official mistress. The people nicknamed her the Queen of Kukui. Patriarch Adrian himself came to speak with the Tsar, but he insisted on having his way. All of Moscow was outraged. The Tsar preferred a German heretic to his lawful wife. In the terrible winter of 1699, frozen corpses of Streltsy hung all over Moscow, and the corpses were forbidden to be removed. Flocks of crows circled over the city. Only by the end of February did they begin to bury the Streltsy in mass graves at the city entrances. Then, in crowded places, sheets appeared with the Tsar's decree. For the glory and beauty of the state, all ranks of people, except the clergy, coachmen, and plowing peasants, shall wear Hungarian and German dress. That is the law. Traditional Russian clothing covered the body completely, and therefore the clothing was suited to the climate. European clothing, on the other hand, emphasized the figure and restricted movement, and therefore it was very uncomfortable for Russians. It was tight, cold, and embarrassing. But after Peter's decrees, anyone who dared to appear in public in old Russian clothing was forced to kneel, after which their long hems and long sleeves were cut off completely. Peter demanded a complete change, not only in clothing, but in the entire way of life. believing that this would transform the Russian person into a European. European dress was revealing and tight, and hair was styled in elaborate coiffures. However, despite the extreme discomfort of corset dresses, Russian ladies embraced them willingly. But not everyone was willing to give up the traditional kika headdress to avoid looking bareheaded. And only later, with the greatest difficulty, did they actually replace it with a fontange made of starched lace. If previously the clothing of boyars and peasants differed only in the quality of fabrics, trimming, and decoration, now a divide occurred. The peasantry remained in their old clothes, while the nobility dressed in the very height of European fashion. But people wanted traditional clothing. Officers asked for military uniforms in the old Russian style, not even 50 years after Peter's death. Fur coats with fur hats, Russian felt boots, and many other items would quickly return to the nobleman's wardrobe. New outfits and manners were to be displayed at assemblies. Social gatherings with dancing, feasting, and conversation. They symbolized the social activity of the nobility, in addition to their unity around the Tsar. But this was a new and strange affair for Russia. The once secluded young women quickly adapted to these innovations and developed such a taste for them that a few years later, Peter himself bitterly noted the decline in morals. An improper girl laughs and talks with everyone, runs through the streets with her bosom exposed, sits with other young men, pushes with her elbows, doesn't sit still, but sings lewd songs, makes merry, and gets drunk. It led to lewd behavior. This, Peter thought, was extremely shameful behavior, and he wanted to stop it right away. At these assemblies, where tobacco smoke hung thick in the air, people drank wine, beer, and coffee. Coffee had only recently come into fashion even in Europe. In Russia, it was completely unknown, and people would spit it out due to its bitterness. Beer had been brewed in Russia before, but there was a lack of skill and experience. The same was true for cheese. Sausages were made by stuffing washed intestines with buckwheat. Peter, who was very fond of Dutch cuisine, very enthusiastically introduced it in Russia. Sausages and spiced meatlings, salted herring, and cakes that were called inside-out pies. Previously, Russians had managed well with turnips, but Peter ordered the cultivation of potatoes. At first, few people knew that they should eat the tubers, and many were poisoned by the toxic berries. Ladies used potato flowers as decoration, sometimes in their hair. The sunflower, brought by Peter, was also initially grown as an ornamental plant. Oil from the seeds wasn't produced until 100 years later. Many in Moscow were dissatisfied with the new ways and wanted change.
Come on,
but they were afraid
Has
to
that ever
speak
happened
openly
before?
about it. But when Peter Alexievich began traveling to the city of Voronezh, where he was tirelessly building a navy, tongues began to loosen. They blamed all their troubles on the German Lefort, a drunkard and
Did you see
libertine
that?
who had led
What
the
even is
sovereign
that?
astray, they
Was that
claimed.
Peter himself?
A rumor spread that Lefort had fallen ill with fever and would not show his face outside his house. And many boyars openly rejoiced, saying they wished Lefort would die soon, so their great sufferings would end. Peter disregarded the opinions of the boyars, and he even ignored the Boyar Duma. Instead, the Privy Chancellery, which was composed of the Tsar's main associates, began to function. It became the very first step towards the creation of the governing Senate, the same Senate that would begin its work in 1711. The Senate oversaw diplomacy, justice, trade, state revenues and expenditures, and other matters. Decisions were made collectively at general meetings, and minutes were consistently kept and supported by the signatures of all participants. Thus, the Tsar delegated some of his powers to the Senate, while simultaneously placing personal responsibility on each and every one of its members. The Senate's work was overseen by the Procurator General, who reported directly to the sovereign. He was called the Eye of the Sovereign.
Instead of the system of prikazi, or departments, Peter introduced collegia based on the Swedish model. The spheres of activity for each collegium were strictly delineated. The collegia also introduced a consultative, or collegial, system of management. Catherine the Great would later reform the work of the collegia, increasing their number to 12, and in 1802, Emperor Alexander I would replace them with the first ministries, thereby establishing the fundamental principles of their operation. These fundamental principles essentially remain in place to this day.
Peter ordered the boyars to send their sons abroad to study both military and naval affairs, subjects of interest to him. In Russia, education was primarily focused on humanities, but the Tsar needed many engineers and technicians.
Just 2 years later, a school of mathematical and navigational sciences would open in Moscow. Later came artillery, medical, engineering, and mining schools, as well as a naval academy. Free arithmetic schools for children were established in the provinces. In the year 1724, the very first Russian Academy of Sciences was opened. By the year 1917, Russia had 11 universities, 113 other institutions of higher education, and 123,745 primary schools. Quite the accomplishment.
I told him, do it like this.
Not your way.
When visiting the Voronezh
Not your
shipyard,
way.
Peter Alexeyevich
Do what I
now
said,
found
just
peace
do
of
it.
mind. It is just a pity that Franz could not come due to illness. He would have admired all the fine young men who had arrived in Voronezh after studying in Holland and England. They left as simple, ignorant youths, but then they returned as exemplary young men who are worthy of emulation. They wore new clothes as if born in them, spoke several languages fluently, drew blueprints, and they even mastered sciences and machinery. Gradually, the seemingly petrified mass of Russian life, as Peter saw it, this great mass began to shift. But how much more there was to do, to correct, to change. It was endless. Forced Europeanization affected all social classes except the most numerous of the social classes, the peasants. The peasant, just like 200 years ago, relied solely on his own labor to grow the exact same crop during the extremely short northern summer as on the southern black earth. He had to cultivate 3 to 4 times more land, and no less than that. Peasant life was shaped by the cold climate and was difficult. Sheepskin coats and felt boots keep you warm in winter. Bast shoes and shirts don't restrict movement when working in summer. Houses were built from the most readily available material, wood, and insulated as best they could. Small windows and low doors.
Peter realized that it was impossible to turn a Russian peasant into a Dutch one. Nevertheless, he regulated peasant life as well. His decrees dictated how to harvest grain, build huts, and how many times a week to heat the bathhouse. The costs of reforms and endless war fell on the shoulders of the peasantry. To increase revenue for the treasury, taxes were imposed on private fishing, inns, mills, apiaries, and even on stables. From every 100 households, 1 recruit was taken, a soldier, and the taxation system changed. Previously, tax was collected per household, but peasants started enclosing multiple farms with a single fence. In response to this, the state introduced a brand new poll tax of 74 kopecks per year, a tax for each male resident.
A messenger brought an urgent dispatch. Franz Yakovlevich was on his deathbed. Life was as bright as fireworks,
Oh, glad
but
you
every
came,
celebration must come to an end. What is there to
guys. Keep
regret?
up the good work.
The son of a simple
Lovely.
Geneva merchant,
Oh, look who's
managed
here.
to become
Well
an
done.
advisor and loyal friend to the ruler of the world's largest
up.
country.
Oh,
His
nice.
mission was accomplished.
Let's have a drink.
Peter will carry on from here.
Oh, Hungarian?
And he, Lefort, who gave Peter his word to serve until
toast.
the end of his life,
To the clinking
kept
of
his
glasses.
promise. Because
Let's raise
Franz
our
Lefort's
glasses.
word is as good as gold. Lefort ordered musicians to be brought in, tables to be
Music.
set, and cups to be filled. Send away the
Violins.
doctors now, and call for friends. and feast. Ah, what a pity that Peter isn't here. He would have appreciated Franz Lefort's last celebration. At dawn, a mud-splattered carriage entered the courtyard. Peter ran up the stairs. The rooms were empty and quiet. Tired servants were cleaning up the traces of yesterday's celebration. And he realized that now he was alone. Those around him were loyal servants, but his friend was gone.
The memory of Franz Lefort lives on in the name of Moscow's Lefortovo district, as well as in the names of an alley in Moscow and streets in Geneva and Kaliningrad. His Moscow house, later rebuilt and known as the Lefortovo Palace, is recognized as a cultural heritage site.
After burying his friend with the highest military honors, Peter was returning to Voronezh. On the way, he remembered. All the nobility gathered around the lavishly decorated coffin, their faces showing immense grief. But Peter knew that many were rejoicing at Franz's death. They must think that without him the sovereign will stop his eccentric behavior, stop making everyone change their clothes, stop remaking everything. Fools! They still haven't understood anything. Everything needed to be changed, not just to follow his decrees, but to think in a new way. Only in this way, by discarding centuries-old customs without regret, could the Muscovite Tsardom be transformed into an advanced European power. Peter began changing the culture according to modern Western models. A new literary language was taking shape. According to the Tsar's plan, Russia, which was previously perceived by its people as the last bastion of orthodoxy, was to leave the realm of church culture and become a secular state. Peter believed that the church font was simply not convenient for quick reading. Peter kept the church font only for liturgical books, and he personally developed a new civil font. The font was used to write letters, compose documents, print books, textbooks, and newspapers.
Under Peter's rule, 4,500 new words, borrowed from European languages and still used today, entered the Russian language. For example, ball, system, barrier, complement, politics, portrait, and secret. Military vocabulary was completely updated: admiral, trench, uniform, pistol, parade, and much more. All naval terminology entered the Russian language from Dutch during Peter's reign. Such a rapid and large-scale renewal of the language would only occur again in Russia in the 20th century. This was when the Bolsheviks came to power, and they would also radically change the way of life and introduce new words and concepts.
The first newspaper in Russia appeared during the reign of Tsar Mikhail Fyodorovich. In the ambassadorial office, handwritten couranti were compiled. Brief summaries that included articles from foreign newspapers and other information that were intended only for the Tsar and the Boyar Duma. Peter, however, began printing a publicly accessible newspaper called Vedomosti. Its first issue was published on January 13th in the year 1703. And this is why the date January 13th is now officially celebrated as Russian Press Day. Before Peter, a day was divided into daytime and nighttime hours, and clock faces had 17 divisions. There used to be such a clock face on the Spasskaya Tower. A clockmaker used to work in the tower, and he manually set the time to 1 o'clock exactly at sunrise. The bell would notify all of the townspeople that a new day had begun, and it would strike every hour. Then at sunset, the clockmaker would switch the clock to nighttime mode. As a result, on the longest day of the year, there were 17 daytime and 7 nighttime hours. Therefore, there were 17 divisions on the clock face. In total, a single day consisted of exactly 24 hours. But every day, the clock hands needed to be adjusted in order to start the time count from sunrise. It was under Peter that clocks got the familiar 12 divisions we know today. New clock faces were installed on the Spasskaya and Troitskaya towers of the Kremlin and on the bell tower of the Church of the Archangel Gabriel. In Russia, before Peter, the annual time cycle was measured not by the Julian calendar, as sometimes thought, but by the Byzantine calendar. This calendar was also called the Great Indiction. The chronology was counted from the creation of the world, and the new year began on September 1st. Days and months were counted from both Orthodox holidays and fasts. Peter introduced two innovations to the Byzantine calendar. The chronology was now counted from the birth of Christ. Furthermore, the new year began on January 1st. In 1917, after the February Revolution, the Gregorian calendar was introduced in Russia. The difference between the calendars was 13 days. And this is why Christmas in the Orthodox Church is now celebrated on January 7th, after New Year's Day instead of before it. Decrees were posted all over Moscow to universally recognize the new year, the 1700th from the birth of Christ, starting from the 1st of January. To celebrate the new year, make decorations from fir trees, entertain children, and go sledding down hills. And adults should be sure to refrain from drunkenness and brawling, because there are enough other days for that. Previously, the new year was celebrated with a festive prayer service and a religious procession. Peter ordered that after the prayer service, there should be mass celebrations throughout the festive week, from January 1st to 7, along with the firing of cannons and rifles, bonfires at night for illumination, and homes decorated with both pine and juniper branches and filled with joy.
The New Year's celebration we know today with Christmas trees and firecrackers was established by Peter the Great, as was the tradition of secular holidays. At first, decorations made from fir branches didn't catch on. It wasn't until the second quarter of the 19th century that the custom of decorating a Christmas tree became established, which under Soviet rule was again called a New Year's tree, as in Peter's time.
The festivities were in full swing, and Peter couldn't take his eyes off his beloved for even a moment. Once again, he recalled the images from the cherished book of his childhood. Knights in shining armor, magical cities, a beautiful maiden, and life, an entire life, like an eternal celebration. Why hesitate? Could he find a better wife? Oh, if only Anna loved him as much as he loved her. But to his sincere passion, she responded with only a rehearsed, polite smile that betrayed cold detachment. It was the exact same expression that the Tsar sometimes noticed on the faces of foreign advisors when he shared his plans to transform his homeland along European lines. So perhaps everything he had been striving for was a mistake. The celebration ended, and with it, all doubts evaporated. The sovereign departed for Voronezh once again. A great war lay ahead, and the fleet, army, and entire country had to be rebuilt. He didn't look back at Moscow. He could already see a new city in the distance. Streets straight as arrows, canals, palaces, and enormous ships in the harbor. He didn't yet know where this city would be, but he firmly believed that it would exist. Since Peter became the absolute ruler of the realm, the Tsar was rarely ever seen in Moscow. He conducted maneuvers with his toy regiments, built wooden fortresses, and then captured them himself. Meanwhile, a whole heap of decrees had already piled up. Finally, the door burst open with a bang. Into the chamber burst the disheveled and grimy sovereign of all Russia. He grabbed a scroll at random. It read, "And since this is by no means possible, it is necessary to..." "Well then," he said, Let them decide for themselves what needs to be done. Woe to the country whose ruler is mad. What will become of the Russian Tsardom if the sovereign behaves like a child and, as if possessed, plays with toy soldiers? Many years will pass since then, and Peter the Great, ruler of all Russia, will reshape the entire state system and economy in order to create Russia's first professional army ever in all of history. And he will lead it into battle against the most powerful military force ever to be seen in Europe. Throughout history, the army has always remained the main guarantor of the country's security. The troops defended the borders. The troops suppressed rebellions and riots. The throne was supported by an army loyal to the Tsar, and the empire relied on the army.
The Russian army was very large, but it was also diverse in its composition. It was primarily composed of noble cavalry, Streltsy infantry, and soldier regiments of the foreign formation. A nobleman, in exchange for military service, received a land grant, an estate, from the Tsar, and used its income to acquire horses, weapons, and equipment. At the first call, the noble cavalry would arrive at assembly points for military reviews or set out on campaigns. The backbone of the Russian infantry was formed by the Streltsy. The Streltsy underwent combat training, and they lived in separate settlements with their families. During peacetime, they performed guard duty, and they fought fires. Many ran shops, engaged in trade, or pursued other private businesses. In addition, a separate part was formed by the so-called regiments of foreign formation. Initially, they were based on foreign officers and soldiers, and they served as the Tsar's personal guard.
According to an old tradition, each Russian Tsarevich had a set of weapons and armor, as well as his own army that was recruited from boys of the same age, and it was called Poteshnoi, the Toy Regiment. But Peter Alexeyevich needed everything to be real, including uniforms, weapons, provisions, and even cannons, along with cannonballs and gunpowder, artillery masters, and experienced officers. By the year 1686, the young Tsar had at his disposal an extremely well-trained force, and this force was in no way at all inferior to a real army. It was the troops of the foreign formation that the young Tsar Peter took as a model for his army. He formed exactly 2 regiments from his toy troops, the Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky. And Peter himself drafted the military regulations for his regiments. Foreign teachers taught him both the German and Dutch languages, since all important military books were not written in Russian but in those languages, geometry, astronomy, as well as fortification. And his toy soldiers? They studied the same subjects. And then again, the drum, and again, firing practice, storming fortresses, and marching left, right, left, right. In just 10 short years, the former boys from the toy regiments would become the most combat-ready and professional military force in the whole of Russia. The army was in need of serious reforms. It was effective for war against old adversaries, the Crimean Khanate and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. But Peter, well, he faced all sorts of problems that had but recently seemed insignificant. From Arkhangelsk to the Volga, foreign trading companies completely dominated Russia. The English, Dutch, Swedes, and Danes bought Russian goods for a mere pittance, exporting them to Europe on huge ships. The English Parliament held numerous hearings in an attempt to determine whether or not to turn the lands along the Volga into a British colony. At the court of Polish kings, it was discussed that Russia should become for Poland what the American colonies were for England, with many arguing in favor. Russia did not have a fleet, nor did it even have access to the seas. The Swedes, who had built fortresses all along the coast, blocked access to the Baltic, while from the south, Turkish bastions pressed against Moscow, blocking traders' access to the Black Sea. The Russian state, despite its vast expanses, could have turned from a great empire into a colony like those in Africa within just a few years. Peter made a decision. He would break through to the seas, no matter what the cost would be, to build ports and ships there, in order to create a navy. And the Tsar's main goal? It was to gain access to the Baltic. This meant war with the strongest army in all of Europe at that time. The forces of the Swedish king known as Charles XII. The Swedish king was just 15 years old. In Europe, they scoffed and thought he was incapable of anything. Behind his back, Charles was called a boy who was in over his head trying to fill his father's shoes. Peter formed a military alliance with both Poland and Denmark, and then he set about strengthening his army. He recruited soldiers and foreign officers. Sparing no expense, he purchased rifles, cannons, and ammunition. And finally, he made up his mind. To mark the beginning of the military campaign, they held a celebration. Peter couldn't take his eyes off Anna Mons. His beloved was more beautiful than she had ever been before. Toasts followed one after another. To His Majesty, to each general individually, to the artillery and infantry, and to the allies. The Tsar's orderly, Alexashka Menchikov, appeared clanking with tin buckets on his feet. He was imitating Charles in his boots. He climbed onto the table, and the guests, breathless with laughter, threw at him whatever they could get their hands on. Peter was good-naturedly having fun along with the guests. He did not yet know at the time that young Charles of Sweden had swiftly and easily knocked both the Polish and Danish kings out of the war completely, but he soon learned. Russia was left without any allies at all. In September 1700, the vanguard of the Russian army approached the Swedish fortress of Narva. Meanwhile, intelligence reported to Peter. King Charles was already on his way with reinforcements. The Tsar hurriedly left for Novgorod in order to quickly organize the transfer of lagging troops and artillery. By all calculations, there was only a week left until the imminent arrival of the enemy army. The soldiers who were besieging Narva were all impatiently waiting for the real action to finally begin, the big battle. And until the Tsar, Peter, would finally arrive with both reserves and cannons, they could pass the time with a mock battle. And then, all of the jokes came to an end. The calculations on which the sovereign relied turned out to be wrong. Charles of Sweden appeared at the walls of Narva earlier than expected and unleashed the full might of his army on the Russian regiments. Captain Mikhailo Golitsyn realized, this is the end. Close ranks! The Swedish infantry attack broke through the front in 3 places at once, and the Russians fled in disarray. The mercenary officers immediately surrendered, and some were killed by their own soldiers. Peter was in Novgorod at this time. He did not see how his army was perishing in the snowy whirlwind, how the recruits in Streltsy, maddened with terror, were rushing about, and how on the right flank stood, as if rooted to the ground, 3 regiments: Preobrazhensky, Lefortovsky, and Semyonovsky. A bullet pierced my leg. Load! Fire!
Fire!
The Swedes stopped. Second volley! Blood was already squelching in his shoes. A second bullet tore through the coat, striking the shoulder. The battle was already lost, but they held on, standing literally knee-deep in blood. Yesterday's toy soldiers, the future guards of the Russian army. Later, in memory of this, red stockings would be incorporated into the uniforms of the guards regiments. But then, at Narva, out of the entire encircled Russian army, King Charles allowed only these 3 regiments to leave the camp with weapons and banners, to the beat of drums, out of respect for their immense courage and their tireless fighting skills. Peter met the remnants of his army in Novgorod. Stretched out along the entire road, unarmed, ragged soldiers trudged through the mud. His army was no more. Suddenly, the cold silence was broken by a distant drumbeat, in blood-stained uniforms. Struggling to maintain their thinned ranks, the Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky regiments marched in formation, with weapons and banners, his strong, undefeated guard. And Peter understood what needed to be done. Now the entire Russian army must become such a guard. This will be a new army, one that can fight any enemy, under any circumstances, without ever relying on anyone's help at all. And win. The events at Narva showed that the Russian army lacked not only experience and training, but also discipline. Desertion, and especially treason, had to be prevented very harshly. Peter was especially wrathful and ruthless towards officers who dared to defect.
Peter introduced discipline in the Russian army, regulated by military statutes. Violations were subject to a system of punishments, ranging from arrest and flogging with rods to the death penalty for treason. For theft, a shameful brand was burned onto the face. Cowardice and desertion were punishable by hanging. For blasphemy against the sovereign and commanders, as well as looting, the punishment was beheading or quartering. The final version of the charter was published in the year 1716. Later, even when deciding criminal cases, it was often Peter the Great's military charter that was referred to.
By the time of Peter's reign, military affairs in Europe had changed significantly. Infantry, cavalry, and artillery operated in battle as a single mechanism. Commanders were required to know tactics, topography, and mathematics, and soldiers were required to display discipline and military skills which were achieved through training and education. Russia needed an army that was not just large, but one that was regular and professional, and capable of defending the country at any given moment.
Peter began its creation using the experience of the foreign formation regiments and former toy regiments. He announced the recruitment of volunteers for military service with pay, and he also regularized conscription, drafting serfs, one recruit from every few dozen households. To prevent conscripts from running away, they were immediately shackled. A recruit mark was tattooed on the left arm, a gunpowder cross. If a recruit ran away, he couldn't return home, and the peasants of his community had to provide a new person. The age of conscripts ranged from 20 to 35 years. Military service was declared lifelong, and relatives mourned conscripts as if they were dead. Thus, 29 infantry, as well as 2 dragoon cavalry regiments, were formed, making an overall total of 32,000 men.
Passing by the parade ground, Peter Alexeyevich stopped. Major of the Guard Mikhail Golitsyn, sparing no effort, was struggling with the newly recruited soldiers. It was painful to watch.
March!
The village boys didn't know how to march in formation.
I said left.
In addition,
Left!
no one knew how to handle equipment and weapons, and they were terrified of the officer.
Left! Move!
Golitsyn's
I said
voice
left.
was hoarse from giving commands, but it was all in vain.
Left!
The recruits
Keep the
didn't understand a
formation.
variety of concepts, including march right and march left.
Hay on the left! Straw on the right!
After some thought, Peter ordered a bundle of hay to be tied to each recruit's left leg, and a bundle of straw to the right. And when on the parade ground, instead of the usual left-right, they heard hay straw. Hay straw! Things immediately started to improve.
Hey! Straw! Hey! Straw! Hey! Straw!
And Peter, who was in high spirits, continued on his way. Now it was time to create their own officer corps. A Russian one. Peter sent letters to all of the governors
of all nobles.
to compile a list of
Sons
nobles
fit
and
for
their
service.
children. From these, the Tsar chose those fit for service and personally assigned them to regiments. Peter's messengers rushed to all corners of Russia.
In 88 cities, the authorities deemed a whopping 11,147 landowners fit for service. All of the remaining nobles were ordered to stay ready and report for duty at the very first call.
The rank of officer implied not only noble birth, but also extensive knowledge. Initially, Peter sent young people to study abroad, but he soon established special officer schools, including artillery and engineering ones where mathematics, ballistics, topography, and tactics were taught. For the first time in Russia, military education emerged. Just a year after Narva, there were no foreigners at all among the officers of the Semyonovsky Regiment. And there were only 3 in the Preobrazhensky Regiment. Amazingly, 206 Russian noble officers were sent to General Sheremetev's troops alone. Whenever he could spare even an hour, Peter would come to the German quarter, to his Anushka, in the large, beautiful house he had given her. Home comfort, delicious food, and the radiant eyes of his beloved. What else does a tired soldier need? Peter loved for Anna to greet him in the old Russian tradition, with a shot of vodka, a small pie, and a kiss. He also loved boisterous feasts, rowdy behavior, crude jokes, drunken soldiers. But she longed for beauty, tenderness, flowers. Well, if it's flowers she wants, flowers it is. Danielich, quick! Menchikov, as always, turned around in the blink of an eye. The flowers seemed vaguely familiar to Anna, because they had simply been torn from her own flower bed. Peter didn't bother with such trifles. He was engrossed in the new armament for the infantry, and everything else could wait.
The infantry formed the backbone of the army. The infantry formation was protected from cavalry attacks by pikemen with long pikes pointed at the enemy. Over time, rifles with long fixed bayonets came to replace pikes. Ammunition was stored in pouches, a round bullet and a portion of powder that was wrapped in a paper cartridge. Following orders, the soldier would bite off the paper and pour some powder into the pan of the gun lock. The rest of the powder was poured into the barrel, where the bullet was also inserted, ramming the charge with a ramrod. The first rank would fire simultaneously and then fall back. The second rank would then move forward and fire the next volley. On average, reloading in battle took a unit 20 to 30 seconds, and this allowed for 2 to 3 shots per minute. Only well-trained soldiers could achieve such firing speed, and sometimes even a greater speed than that. Thus, during battle, a continuous barrage of rifle fire would rain down on the enemy along the entire front. At that time, this was considered the most advanced and effective method of combat.
Present arms!
1, 2, 3!
The training introduced by Peter bore fruit. The Turks and Persians believed that the Russians shot directly from their fingers, and therefore after battles they examined the hands of the dead, wondering if they were human. Of all the military branches, Peter particularly favored artillery. That's why the
take a
artillerymen
guess.
of the Semyonovsky regiment prepared especially meticulously for the Tsar's review. The Tsar had begun his military service in the Bombardier Company. Since then, he enjoyed conducting firing
Here,
exercises himself.
Catch the cannonball!
Once, during a misfire, he nearly lost his eyesight and his life. But this didn't dampen his enthusiasm for artillery. Peter studied cannon aiming techniques, gunpowder properties, and the design of guns and gun carriages. In the year 1697, after completing an artillery course in Königsberg, he received a certificate stating that Peter may be recognized everywhere as a very competent, careful, skillful, and fearless firearms master and artisan. Since then, the Tsar insisted on being addressed as nothing less than Mr. Bombardier, and he sometimes signed his letters as Bom, Bar, Deer in 3 syllables. Upon returning to Moscow, Peter went straight to Anushka's place. He intentionally didn't announce his arrival. It was a surprise. A voice was heard behind the door, male and unfamiliar. They were speaking German. Now that's truly a surprise. Franz Koenigsegg, envoy of the Polish King Augustus, a former ally. Is our brother Augustus in good health? He's well, Koenigsegg assured, but quite distressed about the lack of funds for the war against Charles of Sweden. Not enough, you say? Peter interrupted him.
Looks like it
seems all the funds went into this construction. I drink to the health of my brother Augustus.
To the king's health. To our brother Augustus.
Oh, your majesty, Koenigsegg stammered.
To Augustus!
The affections of the young
This
goddess,
is merely a
whose
humble
beauty is
offering to
beyond
the young
compare.
goddess, whose incomparable beauty. Well,
All
go
right.
on. To the health of my brother Augustus.
Drink to the health of our brother Augustus. Bottoms up!
Look how he is drunk.
Come on,
Koenigsegg
guys!
didn't last even an hour.
Come here, big boy.
Watch out, gentlemen. It seems this fellow is in dire need of a long nap.
It's all right, he'll come around. He'll think twice before bringing bouquets again. Two long years had passed since the defeat at Narva. But Peter's determination to reclaim access to the Baltic from the Swedes only grew stronger. He knew exactly what he wanted, and he thought how to get it. Before marching on Narva, it was decided to capture the fortress of Noteberg. This fortress stood on an island at the mouth of the Neva River, and its capture would allow the use of the river for transporting goods and supplying the Russian army. For 2 weeks, Russian artillery bombarded Noteberg. Finally, a section of the eastern wall collapsed. After crossing the river, the Russians tried to storm the fortress through this breach, but the siege ladders turned out to be too short. The Swedes pelted the Russians with grenades, and so the assault came to a halt. Standing on the cape near the silent battery, Peter watched the chaotic melee at the walls. "Well," he said, "it is time for the guards." Lieutenant Colonel Mikhailo Golitsyn, having received the order, rushed to the shore. His Semyonovsky men, bending their oars, flew in boats towards the fortress, to certain death. Upon landing, Golitsyn led his men, running into the assault. The soldiers stubbornly climbed the walls under a barrage of grape-shot grenades and stones, but did not advance even an inch. In the 6th hour of the battle, Peter could not bear it anymore and sent an order. "Do not waste lives, retreat." The messenger brought Golitsyn's reply. "Now I belong not to you, sire, but to God alone." Peter managed to see how stubborn Mishka was, pushing boats into the river, so that no one would be tempted by the opportunity to retreat. It was the madness of the brave, outright suicide. But Menchikov caught Golitsyn's boats, put his reserve on them, and without waiting for orders, went to the rescue. After 12 hours of assault, Noteberg finally raised the white flag. This ancient Russian fortress on Orakovi Island was called Oreshek, before it was captured by the Swedes. Peter ordered it to be named Schlisselburg, the key city. This victory was indeed crucial, and it allowed them, a few months later, to capture the fortress of Nyenschans, 50 kilometers from Schlisselburg, where the new capital of the Russian Empire, the city of St. Petersburg, was founded.
As time went on, Schlisselburg indeed became a kind of key to the northern capital. In the year 1941, the capture of this city by German troops marked the beginning of the Siege of Leningrad, a siege which lasted 872 days. The Oreshek fortress itself on the island resisted for 500 days, never allowing the enemy to cross to the right bank of the Neva and cut off the road of life. Only the liberation of Schlisselburg in the year 1943 first allowed for improved supplies to the northern capital, and then completely lifted the siege.
Mikhailo Golitsyn survived by a miracle. And as soon as he recovered from his wounds, Peter promoted him to colonel. All surviving Semyonovsky Regiment soldiers were generously rewarded, and now they greeted the Tsar with a drumbeat, standing under their regimental banner.
By Peter's decree, each and every military unit had a banner. Company banners were colored cloths with an eagle, while the regimental banner was white. Abandoning the banner in battle was punishable by death. If after a battle only a few men remained from the entire regiment, but the banner survived, the regiment continued to exist and was rebuilt anew.
Peter managed to break away from the front and come home for just a couple of days. The first thing he did was visit his Anushka. He had missed her terribly. He sent away his entourage. He wanted to finally be alone with his beloved without all that crowd of loyal drunks and troublemakers. But it seemed no one was expecting him here. So that's how it is. While his loyal drunks and troublemakers were standing by him to the death, the woman he loved and trusted most had betrayed him. Simply and casually. And now he had to learn to live with this. The next day, Koenigsegg was found in the Neva, in the shallowest part of the water. Apparently, he slipped on a stone while drunk and hit his head. Anna Mons was stripped of any and all privileges and property which had been given to her by the Tsar. She was placed under house arrest, and only after 2 years, following numerous requests, was she allowed to go to the Lutheran church once a week. Almost 4 years had passed since the disaster at Narva. Peter was approaching his main goal, to finally clear the Baltic shores of the Swedes. The fortress of Narva, where it all began, remained one of the enemy's last strongholds. In the summer of 1704, the Russian army besieged Narva for the second time. Astoundingly, the Russian forces outnumbered the garrison by almost 10 to 1. Narva's fortifications were virtually impregnable. Moreover, there was a rumor that General Schlippenbach's 7,000-strong corps was coming to aid the fortress. And then Peter had an idea. All night long, Swedish uniforms were being sewn from blue cloth in the regimental tailoring shops. Peter was rushing around the camp in feverish excitement, explaining nothing to anyone. The soldiers were ordered to replace their live ammunition with blanks, put on blue uniforms, and move to the nearest grove. The Tsar himself dressed up as a Swedish general for some reason. He clearly had something in mind, and was very pleased with himself. Arvid Horn, the commandant of Narva, watched the Russians form their battle lines. Schlippenbach must be the cause of this commotion. Neat rows in blue uniforms appeared, the Swedes. Horn sent a detachment to help them, to catch the Russians in a pincer movement. Suddenly, a strange sight met the commandant's eyes. The detachment he had sent was fleeing back in panic, trying to escape from Schlippenbach's troops. Confused, Horn caught sight of the general himself through his spyglass, and was horrified to recognize Tsar Peter in a Swedish uniform. Imposters. That night, the Russian generals led by Peter had a great time recalling how Menchikov, commanding the fake battle, nearly fell off his horse from laughter. And the looks on the Swedes' faces when they discovered this masquerade.
Hooray! Hooray!
However, they had to admit that the maneuver had failed. They couldn't storm into Narva by brute force. A proper siege had to be initiated. For 2 months, Russian cannons bombarded the fortress. In Narva, fires raged on and famine set in. But when offered to surrender, Commandant Horn responded with an insult. Peter ordered the assault to begin. The Narva garrison fought with fierce determination. And just as the Russians managed to climb the rampart, the Swedes detonated a mine, killing both friend and foe alike. When blood-stained stones stopped raining from the sky, the Russians stormed the city in such a bestial rage that no one was spared. The screams were deafening. The officers couldn't control their frenzied soldiers. Peter entered the city on horseback, as befits a conqueror. The first thing he saw upon entering was a Russian soldier, who was dragging a woman by her hair. In a fit of rage, the Tsar drew his broadsword and cut down the marauder in front of everyone. The rampage came to an abrupt end. They barely managed to rescue Commandant Horn from the hands of the enraged soldiers and take him prisoner along with the remnants of his garrison. 4 years after their first defeat at Narva, the Russian army had their revenge, and now they were heading to winter quarters. Temporary houses were built for the regiment, or soldiers were billeted with local residents. According to regulations, 1 bed was required for every 3 men, assuming 2 would sleep on it, while the 3rd was on guard duty.
A private was entitled to daily rations of 400 grams of meat, mutton or beef, 800 grams of rye bread, 2 shots of wine or vodka, and about a liter of beer. Additionally, each person was allotted 350 kilograms of flour, 160 kilograms of buckwheat or oat groats, and 11 kilograms of salt per year.
Every day, Peter personally approved the daily ration. Afterwards, for a month, he ate only soldiers' food, not allowing himself the slightest indulgence. However, during marches, food convoys were often delayed. Sometimes, due to corrupt quartermasters, the food arrived spoiled. During times of hunger, soldiers resorted not only to hardtack, but also to stealing from locals. Despite extremely harsh punishments, a soldier would never miss even the slightest chance to steal a goose, chicken, or other livestock from an unsuspecting local.
Military pay was quite decent at the time, although unfortunately, payments were often delayed. The subsistence minimum was 2 rubles per year. This amount of money was enough to buy 80 kilograms of wheat flour, 40 kilograms of beef, or 80 kilograms of herring. A colonel received 300 rubles a year, a captain 100, and a private 24, half of which was deducted for uniforms. The troops were supplied with all necessities according to standard patterns, and uniforms were regulated down to the smallest detail. A private was issued, a felt tricorn hat, a long single-breasted cloth coat, green for infantry, blue for dragoons, red for artillerymen, a waistcoat, knee-length breeches and 2 pairs of stockings, a necktie, 2 pairs of footwear, low shoes for marching, boots for guard duty, high boots with spurs for dragoons, and 2 sets of underwear. In winter, a woolen cloak called yapancha was worn.
Army supply contracts were always a lucrative opportunity for merchants and manufacturers. The production of weapons, ammunition, and uniforms brought considerable profit and remained a subject of bribery and theft worldwide. Peter had a habit of feeling the cloth of soldiers' uniforms and cloaks and inspecting their shoes. If they turned out to be of poor quality, the full force of the Tsar's fury would be unleashed on the pitiable culprit. Peter ruthlessly sent those caught stealing to frozen Siberia, slit their nostrils, or simply hanged them if the value of the stolen goods happened to exceed the price of the rope.
Medicine was also regulated in army life. Regimental doctors were issued monastery bags with a set of tools and supplies. Knives, saws, tourniquets, splints, waxed threads, needles, syringes, and lint, a precursor to cotton wool made from cotton threads. The doctors were usually foreigners. They rarely dealt with treating infectious diseases or preventing epidemics, considering their main tasks to be removing bullets and shrapnel, treating wounds, and amputating limbs. However, the most common diseases in the army were actually intestinal infections of various types. At times, these diseases could decimate up to half of the troops.
One day, Menchikov invited the Tsar to come and visit his field quarters. He must have wanted something, it seems. A new housekeeper was serving them at the table. Peter became interested. Who is she? A captive from Marienburg, Menchikov explained. Her name is Martha Katharina, widow of Officer Johann Kruse. He was saying something else, but Peter was no longer listening to him. It was as if the housekeeper had cast a spell on him. Listen here, Katya. I'm staying the night. In the evening, bring me a candle to my bedchamber. I will, Martha Katharina replied quietly. In the morning, Peter left, and the very next day, his orderly came and took the officer's widow, Martha Katharina Kruse, with all her belongings, to the Tsar for good. By the year 1704, the Russian army had recaptured almost the entire southern coast of the Baltic Sea from the Swedes. Peter's strategic objective seemed to have been accomplished. St. Petersburg was being built at the mouth of the Neva River. Piers, ports, military and merchant ships were being constructed. At long last, Russia was preparing to join global trade. And its army made it abundantly clear that there would be absolutely no colonies on Russian soil. Neither Peter nor his generals had the slightest inkling that the greatest test for the army and for the entire country was yet to come. The loss of the Baltic coast forced the Swedish king, Charles XII, to turn his full attention to events occurring in the east. The commander, who had already defeated all of Tsar Peter's allies, decided it was finally time to deal with the Russian problem as well. In June of the year 1708, shocking news reached St. Petersburg. Charles was marching towards Moscow, and he was leading his entire army. The very existence of the Russian state was under threat, and Peter understood this better than anyone else. It's one thing to capture individual fortresses, but quite another to face the main forces of the world's best army. Fortifications were being hastily erected on the western border. Moscow was also preparing for defense. The walls of Zemlyanoy Gorod, Kitai Gorod, and the Kremlin were being repaired, where 2,000 cannons were installed. Russian diplomats tried their hardest to achieve at least a truce, but Charles wouldn't even hear of it. In July of the year 1708, his troops approached the town of Golovchino, near Mogilev. Moscow was less than 600 kilometers away. A letter arrived from Moscow from Catherine Vasilevskaya. That's what his Martha Katharina was called now. Peter became alarmed. How could this be? He had ordered Katerina to be taken out of the city to a safe place. Who dared to disobey? To my sovereign, my light, my joy, may you live for many years. But I will not follow your order. Forgive me. Better allow me to come to you wherever you may be. And if that's not possible, I'll wait for you here. I am with you forever. Where you are, there I am. I remain your devoted servant, Katerina Vasilevskaya. From intelligence reports, Peter knew that the Swedish army was experiencing major supply problems after its endlessly long march, and that a huge convoy with food and ammunition had set out from Riga to meet Charles XII's army. And he also knew the convoy was accompanied by General Lewenhaupt's corps. Peter made a decision. He would find and attack Lewenhaupt and intercept the convoy. The battle was long. Soldiers on both sides were so tired that they sat down to rest, right on the battlefield. But the incredible happened. For the very first time in open battle, the Russians defeated the Swedes, who outnumbered them. Barely catching his breath after the battle, Mikhailo Golitsyn arrived at Peter's quarters. Peter immediately awarded him the rank of Lieutenant General. "You've earned it, Mishka." Now they fought together side by side, with Peter being lower in rank, so that if necessary, Peter could serve under Golitsyn's command. And he didn't consider it shameful in the least. The victory at Lesnia became the turning point of the entire war. The Russians captured a huge convoy with food, uniforms, and ammunition. This convoy was supposed to support the Swedish advance on Moscow, but now it wouldn't. This forced Charles to halt his advance towards the Russian capital. He had no choice but to turn towards Ukraine to wait out the winter, He was moving towards the small Ukrainian town of Poltava, where the outcome of the war was to be decided. Everyone was in their positions. The cavalry commander, General Alexander Menchikov. The artillery commander, Lieutenant General Jacob Bruce. The commander of the Army Center, General Anikita Repnin. The commander of the Guards, Lieutenant General Mikhail Golitsyn. They had traveled this entire journey with him, from the village of Preobrazhenskoye all the way to Poltava. And now they were ready to die for him, as was the entire vast army from general to private. And Peter said to his comrades in arms, "Do, brothers, as I will do, and all with the help of the Almighty shall be well." Silence hung over the ranks, with only the banners whistling in the wind. Suddenly the Tsar raised his voice. And so you must not think
you fight
that you are fighting for Peter
himself,
but for the state that was entrusted to Peter. The battle began before dawn, at 2 o'clock in the morning. Menchikov's cavalry charged into battle. Bruce's artillery showered the Swedish infantry with grape shot. Repnin held the center of the front with his very last ounce of strength. The Swedes rolled forward like an iron wave, and the Russians began to retreat. On the verge of a breakthrough, Peter appeared before the infantry lines. As he watched, the battalion flag on the left flank wavered and tilted. Under a hail of rifle fire, the Tsar galloped along the entire formation. The infantry closed ranks and advanced. The flag straightened. The bullet-riddled ensign, as he fell, managed to plant the flagpole deep into the ground and held it with the weight of his body. At this moment, Golitsyn's guards crushed the enemy's left flank. The Swedes faltered and fled. By noon, the battle was over. The Swedish army ceased to be the strongest military force in Europe. It was defeated by an army that no one had heard of, just yesterday. Years and centuries would pass. The Russian army would expand Russia's borders from the Baltic to the Black Sea, defeat Napoleon, and enter Paris in the year 1814. And in 1945, it would defeat Hitler and raise its flag over the Reichstag. The Battle of Poltava would become but the first in that list of great victories. From Poltava, Peter immediately set off for the village of Kolomenskoye near Moscow, where his beloved, his unwed wife, Catherine, was waiting for him. She was simply radiant with happiness. The comfort of home, delicious food, and the beaming eyes of his beloved. What more could a weary soldier ask for? On the Yauza River, they tested an old and decrepit English boat that the Tsar had unearthed in Izmailovo, among all sorts of junk. The boat swayed lazily back and forth on the sleepy water. Suddenly, with a rustle, the sail unfurled. And it was as if some strange, strong force had seized the ship. The rigging creaked, and spray flew into his face. Battle flags flew, and mighty cannons thundered, shrouding huge ships in smoke. There, far beyond the horizon, where the young Tsar rode precariously in a small riverboat. Thanks to Peter the Great's iron will, Russia would become the only country in the entire world to build a navy literally from nothing at all. In the span of only one human lifetime, it would amazingly make up for 300 lost years.
First of all,
But the Tsar
second,
is not eternal.
we'll hire workers, invite
Who will
specialists from
continue the
Holland.
great reforms when he is dead and gone? To whom should he pass his legacy? His army,
Mainmast.
his navy, his empire?
Main.
For many years, the sovereign would hang all his hopes on his son, Alexe. However, fate would decree otherwise. The history of the Russian Navy began together with the history of the state. When the legendary Prince Rurik came from across the sea with his formidable warriors riding on battleships. For many centuries, Slavs had built riverboats, which were flat-bottomed vessels with steep sides. In the White Sea, Russian pomors hunted fish and sea animals on sailing coke boats. Their hull was shaped much like a walnut shell, so that the ice would not crush the vessel, but would push it up to the surface. But European shipbuilding of the time had made a giant leap forward. Three-masted ships carried enormous cargoes, easily withstanding ocean storms. Seafarers were discovering new lands. 150 years before Peter the Great was born, Ferdinand Magellan had already completed the first circumnavigation of the globe. The Russian kingdom remained powerful, but it was landlocked. Access to the Baltic Sea was blocked by Sweden, while access to the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea was blocked by the Ottoman Empire. By the time Peter ordered the establishment of a shipyard on Lake Pleshcheyevo, Russian shipbuilding was an entire 300 years behind European shipbuilding. Meanwhile, the young Tsar spent all of his free time on Lake Pleshcheyevo. He worked as a carpenter and personally supervised the digging of the canal. He was briefly distracted from his favorite pursuit by his marriage to Evdokia Lopukina and the birth of his firstborn, Tsarevich Alexei. But Peter, who himself was actually only 18 years old at the time, did not yet see his little son as an heir to the throne. And he hadn't thought about the succession yet, because there were more pressing matters. As soon as the rivers opened up, the Tsar hurried to the lake in order to prepare the very first Russian flotilla for its maiden launch. 12-year-old Alexander Menchikov tagged along with the Preobrazhensky regiment, where many of his older comrades served. His comrades told him to sit still and keep his head down. But how could he just sit there?
Yes, well done.
There in the distance, the sovereign's voice rang out. Launch.
Launch!
One after another, boats as large as peasant huts were launched. And then, the mock army approached and greeted the mock flotilla. Meanwhile, maritime powers ruled the world. The might of the British and Ottoman empires, along with the wealth of Holland, Spain, and Portugal, were all based on maritime trade. The Russian kingdom had only one seaport, Arkhangelsk on the White Sea. Caravans of merchant ships came there only during the hot summer months, when the ice retreated.
Russian trade resembled colonial trade. They exported furs, wax, honey, hemp, flax, valuable fish species, caviar, timber, and grain. They imported weapons, fabrics, and luxury goods. Terms and prices were dictated by visiting merchants. This meant there was foreign control over foreign trade. Peter understood that economic control would be followed by political control.
The Russian Tsar traveled to Arkhangelsk in order to see real seagoing ships with his own two eyes. Both English and Dutch ships saluted the small vessel on which Peter and his retinue were traveling. And the sailors, they looked condescendingly at the Muscovite Tsar. Peter ordered them to dock alongside a huge frigate. He climbed everywhere. He grabbed everything with his hands, peppered them with questions in broken Dutch. An upstart young officer inquired as to why His Tsarist Majesty actually needed to know how a ship was built and operated. And why? Because I want to build ships just like these. No, not like these. I'll build them bigger and better. Russia is going to fight wars at sea, and that means that we most definitely need a navy. In late April of the year 1695, 22-year-old sovereign Peter Alexeyevich set out with his army on a campaign against the Turkish fortress of Azov, which blocked access to the Sea of Azov as well as the Black Sea. And 7 months later, he returned to Moscow alone. The defeated Russian army moved slowly across the cold, frozen steppes. But Peter already had a plan. The besieged fortress was supported by the Turkish fleet, supplying the garrison with weapons and provisions. Having no ships, the Russians could not interfere with the Turks, which meant that creating their own fleet was no longer a childhood dream, but an urgent necessity. The games were over. The work had begun. In Voronezh, on the banks of a tributary of the Don River, they established a large shipyard where craftsmen were brought from all over the country. Peasants from neighboring villages were rounded up to cut timber. A war galley that was purchased in Amsterdam was delivered in disassembled form to Preobrazhenskoye, located near Moscow. There, they copied all its components and then sent them to Voronezh.
A galley is a sailing and rowing vessel with a long, narrow hull and shallow draft. Armament consisted of 1 to 3 cannons on the forward platform and 1 to 2 light cannons in the center of the deck. They had 2 or 3 masts, usually with triangular lateen sails. Rowing speed was 6 to 8 knots, which comes out to about 11 to 15 kilometers per hour.
By order of the Tsar, secular and church landowners were united into partnerships called kumpanstva, and they jointly financed the construction of ships. The kumpanstva also included foreign specialists that were hired. Hundreds of carpenters under the direction of Dutch and English supervisors were building the galley fleet. They lived in barracks, in cold and dampness. The death rate reached up to 100 people per day. Those who tried to escape were caught and hanged. The work was poorly organized. The hastily hired foreigners turned out to be far from the best specialists. Ship timber deteriorated under the open sky, while the kumpanstva sought to reduce their expenses, sometimes buying poor quality raw materials on the cheap.
By April of the year 1696, in just a few months, they built 23 galleys. The 36-gun ship Apostle Peter, 2 fire ships, and 1,300 strugs, which were large boats for transporting infantry.
Contrary to fears, not only did the ships not sink, but they confidently set out on the campaign. They did make it, though with difficulty, as they had to stop repeatedly for repairs. But in the year 1696, the formidable Russian flotilla in all its glory appeared in the Sea of Azov. The Turks could not believe their eyes. Their fleet, upon seeing the Russian galleys, did not dare enter the bay. Azov was placed under complete siege from both land and sea. On July 18th, the fortress garrison capitulated, without an assault. On a rocky cape that was called Taganrog, Peter chose a site for a harbor, and it was this same harbor that was to become the very first Russian naval base. Peter considered the Sea of Azov only a bridgehead for advancing into the Black Sea, and perhaps even beyond.
We'll invite specialists from Holland.
Always busy with state affairs, the Tsar had not seen his son
The
for
logs
years.
arrive, we'll decide then, all right?
Yes, okay,
Alexei
got it.
grew up
First.
as a withdrawn and
Second,
distrustful child,
We'll hire workers.
Yes,
and
understood.
influenced by his mother's
We'll
circle.
invite specialists
He
from
could not
Holland.
stand
Yes, got
anything
it.
associated with Peter's name, nor with his reforms.
Second,
Unlike his father,
Yes, all right.
the Tsarevich showed no enthusiasm
understand
for
me?
either
Yes, I
practical matters
understand.
or sciences.
Yes.
And when teachers were sent to him, he would beat them with a stick and drag them by their hair. It was then that Peter ordered the very best foreign teachers to be brought for his son. However, even they failed to make the heir come to his senses. In one of his letters, Peter wrote, "God has not deprived you of reason." The Tsarevich truly had enough ability to master the wisdom of the sciences being studied. But Alexei's mind was exceptionally passive, and it was lazy as well. Unlike his father, who, to obtain the necessary knowledge, did not hesitate to go to Holland himself as part of the Great Embassy. The official purpose of the Great Embassy was to find allies against the Ottoman Empire, while the unofficial purpose was to recruit shipbuilders and sailors for the Russian fleet. The Tsar traveled incognito, under the name of Sergeant Peter Mikhailov, as part of a group of volunteers. The very small town of Zandam was one of the great centers of Dutch shipbuilding. Here, 50 shipyards worked, both day and night. A medium-sized ship was built in only 6 weeks. That's why Peter sought to come here. He wanted to learn how to build ships himself. Peter stayed with an old acquaintance, blacksmith Garrett Kist. Kist had previously worked in Moscow. That same day, the Tsar bought tools, glasses, and he hired himself out as a carpenter at a private shipyard. Then he moved to Amsterdam. At the ceremonial meeting, the burgomaster informed Peter that in his honor, the frigate Holy Apostles Peter and Paul had been laid down at the East India Company shipyard, 100 feet long.
A sailing frigate is a 3-masted warship, and it has full sail rigging. Unlike galleys, it had a wide hull and deeper draft, and because of this, it was more stable. Artillery armament of up to 44 guns was positioned on gun decks along the sides of the ship. Frigates were built only at shipyards that specialized in their construction. First, every last part of the ship was drawn to full scale. On the slipways, vertical stems and beams were attached to the keel, and both ribs and frames were installed as well. Then the frame was planked both on the inside and on the outside, and all gaps were sealed. To protect against rot, the bottom was treated with a hot mixture of resin and tar. Crossbeams, called deck beams, were installed, on which the deck was laid. And then gun ports were cut into the sides. After that, the rigging and the masts were installed, and then the tackle, rope system, and sail equipment were all mounted.
Peter worked in Amsterdam for 3 months. After he had completed these 3 months, he received a certificate from Shipmaster Gerrit Klaas. I hereby certify truly that Peter Mikhailov has studied ship architecture and the drawing of plans thoroughly. and he now knows as much as we ourselves and understands these concepts. It was at this point that Peter persuaded Cornelius Cruys to go to Russia. Cruys was a Norwegian captain, and he was very well known among Dutch sailors. On April 9th of the year 1698, Cornelius Cruys entered Russian service. In the same year, soldier Alexei Semenov of the Bombardier Company of the Preobrazhensky Regiment also began service. Once again, Alexei reread his brother Ivan's letter. He wrote that having joined a Dutch ship as a sailor, he had already seen France and Denmark. And now, following the sovereign, he was planning to go to England. Is that how it is? Your brother gets to study the sea, while you, Alexei, march until you're blue in the face and water the cannons. Peter completely and utterly failed to find allies in the war against the Ottoman Empire. But on his way back to Russia, the Tsar agreed with Polish King Augustus to jointly act against the Swedes. Plans changed. The Tsar was now going to fight not for the Black Sea, but for the Baltic Sea. Despite having failed in its diplomatic mission, the Great Embassy succeeded quite well in its second task. Hundreds of foreign specialists, shipbuilders, gunsmiths, and navigators were all heading to Moscow. Cornelius Cruys arrived in Voronezh. He inspected the shipyard, and then he reported to the Tsar that everything had to be started over. The ships that were built are only good for firewood, and timber should only be dried in covered sheds. It is crucial to use iron nails. It is also important to feed the workers meat and build houses for them. And be sure to hire good craftsmen instead of bad ones. There were dozens of more demands, conditions, and instructions. Peter considered it impossible, but the stubborn sailor stood his ground. During spring, under his leadership, 58 ships were repaired, and 60 new ones were laid down. The companies were abolished, and instead, a unified tax for ship construction and repair was introduced. Thus, 500 kilometers from the sea in Voronezh, a huge ship factory began operating, using the exact same model on which the rest of the country's shipyards would grow. Fyodor Matveyevich Apraksin took charge of the enterprise. He was one of the creators of the Russian Navy, as well as the first president of the Admiralty Collegium, which was the supreme governing body of naval affairs. In addition, Peter himself drew up the project for the country's main shipyard, the St. Petersburg Admiralty.
In the courtyard were located the boathouses, facilities for ship construction with slipways. The slipways were inclined platforms for launching ships into the water. Nearby, dry docks were being built, basins with gates. The ship was brought into the dock, placed on supports, and then water was pumped out of the basin. As a result, workers gained access to the exterior of the hull for repairs. The building itself housed warehouses, workshops, forges, and various services.
Occasionally, the sovereign would visit Preobrazhenskoye. Ever since his wife Evdokia was imprisoned in a monastery by his order, his son Tsarevich Alexei behaved like a wolf cub. Peter understood. He held a grudge over his mother. But there was something else. Something alien in his gaze. And he couldn't decipher it. Peter tried to captivate his son with stories of distant voyages and naval battles. But he would look away, either counting crows outside the window or plotting something sinister.
Mainmast!
War, the formation of the army, and the construction of the fleet
Top
remained
sail.
the Tsar's primary concerns.
Top gallant sail! Gaff!
And Peter would leave, just as suddenly as he had appeared. In the year 1699, the Azov flotilla set out on the Kirch Campaign. The goal was to demonstrate the great strength of the Russian fleet to the Ottoman Empire. The ship, where the Tsar himself served as captain, bore the name Open Gates, and its sailors were actually all soldiers from the Preobrazhensky regiment. Among them was Naum Sinyavin. Yesterday's soldier found it hard to get used to his good fortune. His palms, rubbed raw and bloody by the ropes, ached, but most frightening of all, his knees trembled with excitement when the boatswain ordered him to climb the mast. Little did he know, young Sinyavin was being watched by the sovereign Peter Alexeyevich himself. Like climbing tree branches, Naum scrambled up the ropes step by step, not ever looking down. Higher and still higher. When he reached the top-gallant yard, the Tsar broke into a satisfied smile. Well done, sailor. And although Naum was already standing 12 fathoms above the water, his great happiness could not be contained in his chest. In the distance, he saw the sea. Initially, ship crews were completely staffed by foreigners, as well as officers and soldiers from the Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky regiments. Officers gave their subordinates the orders in Russian, Dutch, and English. Then the fleet began recruiting soldiers, most often from the Arkhangelsk province, since the Pomors had known the sea since childhood. By the year 1700, at least 1,000 Russian sailors served in the fleet. And by the year 1725, there were no mercenaries left among the lower ranks at all. But the terminology remained exclusively Dutch, and this is one of Peter's traditions that exists to this day.
All naval terms, including mast, yard, rigging, tackle, topmast, and hundreds of others, are distorted Dutch words. So the famous word polundra, meaning watch out, comes from the Dutch val onder, which literally means falls down. This was how they warned about falling cargo or mast debris during battle.
According to regulations, a sailor was supposed to take 5 years to master the ship's structure. But in practice, training happened faster. Each recruit chose an uncle from among the veterans, and that uncle taught him the naval profession. The young sailor nephew would wash his uncle's clothes and would also run errands for him. The most agile of all the sailors were assigned as topmen, and they would work at great heights. They climbed the shrouds in both calm weather and storms, moved along the yards, and also furled and set sails.
Begin!
The brightest of them would become helmsmen. They learned the compass points, knew how to steer by them, and maintained the indicated course. All sailors had to tie knots, splice, which means to join torn ropes without visible knots, sew sails, and handle boats both under oars and sail, and much more. Sailor Naum Sinyavin went through several battles. He was severely wounded, and at the age of 28, he rose to the rank of lieutenant. He was already commanding a 2-masted galley as part of the rowing flotilla, which was guarding the approaches to St. Petersburg. The flotilla's mission was set by Tsar Peter himself, to prevent the Swedes from crossing the Neva in the area of the Tosna River. But they began building fortifications upstream, and all the Russian ships went there. At Tosna, they left a detachment of dragoons and 2 galleys on duty. One was commanded by English officer Lawrence, and the other was commanded by Naum Sinyavin. He peered into the fog and, to his horror, he realized The Swedes, having deceived the Russians, began their crossing.
Load!
Both ships rushed toward the shore. The Swedish shore battery opened fire, and the first cannonballs crashed into the hull. Lawrence turned around and simply left, leaving Sinyavin all alone.
To the left!
A cannonball knocked down the mainmast. The galley's bow cannons grew red hot. The vinegar for cooling the barrels completely ran out. And then, all the gunpowder was gone. To show cowardice, to fail the Tsar's trust, that was worse than death. Then Naum gave his sailors the command to go ashore. The rowers and sailors seemed to transform into infantry of the Preobrazhensky regiment.
Come on, brothers, forward!
Lieutenant Sinyavin
Keep going, keep
led
going!
his crew into battle. This attack forced the enemy to abandon their campaign against St. Petersburg. But Russia was not yet ready to confront the Swedes, who were very strong at sea. Having decided to create a navy, Peter sent 35 young nobles abroad where they would get training. And in 1701, he founded a school of mathematical and navigational sciences in Moscow. Nevertheless, annually young men from the most noble families were sent to Holland, England, and Spain, where they would get maritime training. Despite Peter's best efforts, the young nobles were not overly eager to go into heavy naval service. Besides, it was known that Russian midshipmen abroad live quite poorly. They told about it themselves in letters they sent home.
Master, it's time to get
Kana
up.
paid for both tuition and maintenance.
How dare you?
But the money came with long delays. The young men hung around the city looking for a part-time job.
Get out.
Every now and then they would get into unpleasant stories, trouble. Maxim Safariev, the son of a Kaluga landowner, took a servant with him to Holland, a Kalmyk
Answer
boy
me, what's wrong
whose
with you?
name was Denis. Maxim led a merry life,
To the left.
while his servant studied and went to
that's
sea.
it.
On their return, the officers were examined by the
Answer
Tsar
me.
himself.
Where is the mainmast?
Spafariev, as for
Your
him,
Majesty.
well, he didn't know anything at all. When Denis began to prompt
there,
the
right
master,
there.
Peter noticed it, and he took to examining the servant.
All right, show
Out
me.
of 50 people, only 10 people managed to pass the exam, and
Mainmast.
that included Denis.
Main. Top sail.
Peter ordered Spafariev to be enrolled as a sailor, and what became of him is unknown.
Gaff.
And Denis Peridonovich Kolmikov will become a captain. He will receive nobility, and he will serve to the counter-admiral and commander of the port of Kronstadt. Thanks to Peter's efforts, Russia was raising the very first generation of its own naval leaders. And one of them was Naum Senyavin. In signing the order appointing him to be a captain, the Tsar did not doubt his decision. And Naum, receiving the document from the sovereign, could not believe his luck. Captain, a full-blown commander, king and god to the entire crew. He is responsible for the fate of both the ship and the entire crew. He enters
for
the fray.
battle!
At
He
your
is the
command.
last to leave the deck, in the tragic event of a shipwreck. A ship is also a huge household, and there are mountains of orders, statements, and money boards on the captain's shoulders. Everything, from cannon and powder to the last breadcrumbs and piece of rope, must be counted, checked, written down, and put in its place. Having lined up the crew, the captain heads out to inspect the ship, going into its depths where sometimes even sailors don't go.
The lower ranks were located in the forecastle, that is, the bow. The infirmary and galley, the ship's kitchen, were also located there. At night, hammocks made of sailcloth with hooks were hung in the lower deck compartment. In the morning, the bunks were folded up, and then they were stowed in bunk nets along the sides. The stern section was for officers. It housed the wardroom, the officers' mess hall, and the lieutenants' quarters. The midshipmen huddled in a small enclosure. Next door to them is the ship's chaplain and the doctor. Only the captain was entitled to private quarters of his own. A separate sealed powder chamber contained many tons of gunpowder. And of course, emergency and firefighting measures were taken on wooden ships. The permission of the watch officer was required in order to light the lanterns and the stove. Smoking was allowed only during the day on the tank, near the water jet. Special safety lights were lit in strictly designated locations only. The holds contained supplies of drinking water and provisions, salted beef in barrels, crackers and cereals, butter at the waterline, which acted as a natural refrigerator. For very long voyages, livestock and poultry were taken on board, and they were transported in stalls and cages. There was always water splashing in the very depths of the hold. Unfortunately, all the wooden ships were leaking, and the ship carpenters made sure that the water level did not exceed the permissible level.
By order of the Tsar himself, Captain Lieutenant Naum Senyavin took the battleship Devonshire under his command. While the loading was going on, the commander was doing paperwork. Then someone special came aboard, Adjutant General Anton Daviller. He was Peter's favorite, Menchikov's son-in-law, and an important person in general. He was unaccustomed to objections, and he began to reprimand Senyavin from the start. He said that Senyavin was making a mess of the ship. But Peter did not train his captains in such a way that they would listen without complaint to comments from outsiders, whoever they may be. The unhappy victim later wrote to Peter's office secretary, who was Alexei Makarov.
Can you imagine?
I have had to be on bed rest for over a week, and I cannot turn over from the terrible beating I got. Daviller did not dare to actually complain to the sovereign himself.
Gentlemen, cheers!
Meanwhile, Peter's new wife, Catherine, gave birth to the Tsar's two daughters, Anna and Elizabeth. 19-year-old Alexei, the son from his first marriage, remained the only contender for the role of heir to the throne. But would he be able to continue his father's endeavors? The prince spent more time enjoying wild parties over a glass of wine than anything else. In order to introduce his son to affairs of state, Peter gave him his very first serious assignment: to supervise the construction of fortifications in Moscow in case the Swedes decided to invade. As was later reported to the Tsar, the heir did not spend even half an hour at the post entrusted to him. He looked around absent-mindedly, nodded his head, and then he rode off to his companions. Peter was beside himself with rage. He was sometimes lenient toward others' mistakes, but he never forgave a lack of diligence. He called his son in for a talk, scolded him, and appealed to his sense of duty. It would even have come to blows had Catherine not intervened in time. Only she managed to resolve the conflict. However, as soon as Peter left, his son was once again in the company of his friends. While diligently building the Russian fleet, the Tsar personally sketched the design of the St. Andrew's flag. On sailing ships, the length of the flag reached 4 meters, and in the wind, the banner roared like a siren. To lower the stern flag during a battle would have meant surrendering the ship, which was of course unthinkable. Captain Sinyavin's ship of the line Devonshire was entering the port of Hamburg when suddenly a local convoy sloop came to meet it. According to naval custom, all vessels must salute a warship that is flying the national flag. This is done by lowering their pennant. However, this sloop was in no hurry at all to salute the St. Andrew's flag. Captain Sinyavin signaled, demanding a salute to the Russian flag. The insolent German replied, "I don't recognize such a flag."
Weapons ready for
Sinyavin then
battle.
summoned the artillery officer.
Prepare the guns for battle. Load it up. Gunpowder. Ramrod. Cannons at the ready. Fire! Fire!
2 Russian cannonballs flew past. The third hit the sloop's hull squarely, and its pennant fell into the water. From now on, remember that there is a Russian St. Andrew's flag. Captains of different nationalities sailed under the St. Andrew's flag. Peter needed experienced sailors, and the Tsar was not interested in their past. Thus, the Serbian corsair Matija Zmajevic, who was the scourge of the Turkish fleet, was ransomed from prison in Constantinople by the Russian ambassador. Peter personally examined the sailor, and he immediately promoted him to the rank of captain first class. Zmajevic expertly handled galleys, and it was on the galley fleet that Peter placed his main bet in the naval war with Sweden. In the Baltic skerries, narrow, shallow bays, galleys proved more effective than large ships. On June 21st of the year 1714, the Russian rowing fleet that was under the command of General Admiral Apraksin met a very powerful Swedish squadron belonging to Admiral Vatrang at Cape Gangut. Tsar Peter and Apraksin looked through their spyglasses for a long time, and they counted the enemy pennants. After much thought, they decided to make a portage, in order to drag some of their galleys to a neighboring fjord. Admiral Vatrang sent 10 ships, with the aim of intercepting the Russians. But Peter canceled the dragging of the galleys. He waited until the wind was completely calm, and when the Swedish sailing ships became helpless, he then gave the order. 35 galleys under Zmajevic's command shot out of the bay, and they then headed to where the ships sent by Vatrang stood. Apraksin followed suit.
Come on now, brothers! Let's move!
Tsar Peter participated in the boarding attack under bullets and cannonballs, alongside the rowers and soldiers. All 10 ships of the Swedish squadron, along with the flagship Elephant, were now in Peter's hands. And thus ended the very first battle in the long history of the Russian Navy. But the Swedish fleet still controlled the entirety of the Baltic Sea. Russian galleys could fight against it only using pirate tactics, capturing, if necessary, 1 or 2 ships when the opportunity arose. But for ultimate victory at sea, what was needed was not only boarding attacks, but large, well-armed ships, as well as extremely experienced and well-trained crews. Upon entering a naval battle, the ships would line up in a single column, and passing by the enemy, they would open fire. They would act as a single unit, maintaining formation and keeping up their rate of fire. This tactic was called line tactics, and it was for this kind of combat that battleships were created. It was the most powerful weapon of the era, the pinnacle of engineering thought.
The ship of the line, the largest of sailing ships, formed the backbone of the regular naval fleet. A 3-masted warship with 2 or 3 gun decks had on average up to 100 guns and a crew of up to 800 people.
After the victory at Gangut, Peter had a new reason to rejoice. Catherine had, at long last, given him a son. The boy was named Peter in honor of his father. This event changed everything. Now the sovereign could actually choose an heir from between his 2 sons. The Tsar decided to send Alexe a final warning. He demanded that he come to his senses and made threats. For I have not spared and do not spare my own life for my fatherland and people. So how can I spare you, worthless one? Soon the answer came. The Tsarevich renounced the throne in favor of his newborn brother. He wrote that he hoped his father would finally leave him alone now. A month after receiving this letter, Peter fell ill. The disease was so dangerous that the senators, awaiting the tragic end, stayed in the royal chambers around the clock. But the crisis passed, and the Tsar, having finally recovered, wrote, "If you actually renounce the throne, you must go to a monastery." For a pretender who had renounced the throne, this was the only path. Fleeing from this fate and his father's wrath, Alexei escaped abroad. Soon, disturbing rumors began to reach Peter. Allegedly, his son was conducting secret negotiations with the military enemy, the Swedes, and planning to overthrow his father and take his place on the throne. The sovereign's worst suspicions were coming true. On Peter's orders, intelligence tracked down Alexei in Naples, and the Tsar's envoys deceived him into returning to Russia. The Tsar expected that his cornered son would throw all his hatred in his face. But he dodged and squirmed, and he shifted all the blame for the betrayal onto his entourage. Well, the mere fact of relations with the Swedish king is enough to condemn the Tsarevich to death. However, the Tsar did not wish to decide his son's fate himself. His sentence was to be passed by a commission that was composed of the highest officials of the state. Peter no longer felt anger or rage. All he really felt was a doomed emptiness in his soul. After the death sentence was passed, Peter's son was imprisoned in the Peter and Paul fortress, and just 2 days later, he died under unclear circumstances. And a year later, not yet 4 years old, Peter and Catherine's son, little Peter Petrovich, died of an incurable disease. It was this death that finally threw the Tsar off balance. His grief was accompanied by terrible convulsive fits. Peter locked himself in his study, and for 3 days he received no one, and he refused any and all food. And in addition to the father's personal grief, there was also a question of national importance. Who would sit on the Russian throne after he was gone? But the Tsar had to hide his feelings. Outwardly, the way of life in the country had not changed at all, and the war with Sweden was approaching a victorious conclusion. At the end of May of the year 1719, near the island of Ozel, a Russian squadron consisting of 6 ships of the line was stationed. It was tasked with both finding and neutralizing a Swedish convoy, which was known to be escorting merchant caravans. At dawn on May 24th, observers spotted 3 large ships without flags on the horizon, possibly Swedes. On his flagship Deva Maria, Squadron Commander Captain 2nd Rank Naum Sinyavin ordered all sails to be raised and the pursuit to begin. By evening, the distance finally began to close. Sinyavin gave the order that the crew should prepare for battle.
Before battle, a net was stretched over the deck for protection from falling debris from the masts. The ship's controls were protected from cannonballs with logs and barrels of iron scrap. Sand was scattered on the deck so feet wouldn't slip in the blood. The galley stove was extinguished. The approaches to the powder magazine were covered with damp canvas, and the cabin boys ran quickly to bring charges for the guns from there. All temporary partitions were removed, and the lower gun decks became an open gallery, from the captain's cabin to the ship's bow. Gun ports were opened, and artillery crews loaded and then aimed the cannons.
Drawing ever closer, Sinyavin demanded with 2 shots that they show him their flag. The Swedish banners were then unfurled on the masts. The Russian flagship Devonshire raised a red flag on the foremast, the signal for all ships to engage in battle. Cannonballs smashed the hull planking, tore sails, and broke the rigging. Sharp splinters flew in all directions. But sailors, gunners, and officers did their duty. The deck crew tracked down the grenades, known as lighters, in order to cover them with sand. The medical crew dragged away the wounded, while the ship's doctor operated right during the battle. Portsmouth completely lost control and was immediately attacked by a Swedish frigate and brigantine. Sinyavin on Devonshire broke from the line, made a sharp turn, and opened fire with grape shot, all at close range. A barrage of lead bullets swept away everything alive on deck. The frigate, followed by the brigantine, lowered their flags, while only the enemy flagship was escaping. But only 3 hours later it was caught and forced to surrender. The Russians were able to capture the 52-gun ship of the line Achmeister, and they also managed to capture the 34-gun Karl Kron Vapin and the brigantine called Berngardos. They captured 387 men, along with Captain Commander Wrangel. About 50 were killed and another 13 were wounded. Russian losses amounted to a total of 9 killed and 9 wounded. Amazingly, the Russian fleet's very first artillery duel ended in its first victory. Sinyavin was showered with a flurry of awards. He was promoted by skipping a rank to captain commander, and he was granted villages in such numbers that he became one of Russia's wealthiest landowners. 3 years later, Naum Sinyavin would receive the rank of Schautbenacht, that is, Rear Admiral. And he would become the first Russian natural admiral, as Peter would call him. As early as the year 1703, with the capture of the fortress of Nynchans, Russian troops established themselves on the shores of the Gulf of Finland. Peter created the imperial standard. On the golden cloth, a black double-headed eagle under 3 crowns held 4 maps in its beak and talons. They were maps of the White Sea, Caspian Sea, Sea of Azov, and Baltic Sea, and they symbolized that henceforth, the Russian Tsar was the lord of 4 seas. The new victory of the Russian fleet over the Swedes at Grenam Island and the signing of the Treaty of Nystad, which ended the Great Northern War, secured the conquered Baltic territories for Russia, the long-awaited access to the Baltic Sea. And 2 months later, Peter accepted the title of Emperor of all Russia from the senators. It was then that Russia became a maritime empire. In just a few years, Peter managed to create a fleet and raise a generation of Russia's first admirals. Once he had dreamed that his sons Tsarevich Alexei and Peter would share his passion for the sea and continue their father's work, but it was not to be. The entire Russian squadron lined up for the parade, which would be viewed by the sovereign emperor himself. But instead of a battleship, a small old boat came to the roadstead, once found in the Izmailovo barn. On board the boat there were admirals of the Russian fleet, including Rear Admiral Peter Mikhailov, His Imperial Majesty. The boat's stern cannon fired a shot with a loud bang, In response, a salute from the main caliber guns thundered over the Baltic. From the boat, the Emperor looked up with his head raised. Leaving the past behind, he looked to the future, to where the sides of the ships he had built rose in the gunpowder smoke. He began building his capital,
Parallel channels
where it
lined.
was simply not
I
possible
like it
to
all.
build a city. He conceived and designed the capital himself. He rebuilt it many times and forced everyone to live exactly as he envisioned, and no other way, at the cost of enormous sacrifices, on deadly swamps, and under the assault of devastating floods. Russia's first planned city would rise. Along arrow-straight streets, stone houses would stand next to each other in neat rows. The embankments would be clad in granite. Many squares would open up, and the tall spire of the Peter and Paul Cathedral would pierce the sea fog, like the mast of a massive ship that was sailing into the future. Peter the Great's creation, St. Petersburg, would become the main symbol of his transformations. But until his last day, the Emperor would never decide to whom he wanted to pass his legacy. It was a fair day. The Tsar was in excellent spirits. They quickly determined the correct location for the bastion and ravelins. But Peter wished to inspect the neighboring islands as well. He was delighted. A true paradise, he said. It smells of the sea. By that time, the Tsar had managed to visit both England and Holland. Their capitals are built on water, and not by accident. Where there's sea, trade flourishes and people become
This will be
enlightened.
paradise.
It's decided.
Prospect will go there.
Right here, Danilich. You'll build
Here,
me a house.
Build the fortress. Do you understand
Menchikov,
me?
his
Yes,
old
yes, very
comrade,
good.
had doubts.
There will be paradise.
What house, mein
Here,
Herz,
there.
will drown?
Everywhere.
The Tsar acted as if he didn't hear. And where you're standing, we'll build you a palace. Peter had long dreamed of building a great European city. But as it happened, it was war that dictated the location for construction. By spring of the year 1703, the Russian army had recaptured from the Swedes part of the Baltic Sea coast, up to the mouth of the Neva River. The local swampland was the least suitable place for building Peter a new capital. But a fortress was needed in order to protect the new territories. The Emperor founded it on May 16th, or the 27th in the new style, of the year 1703, on the island of Janissary, which in Russian was called Hare Island. It was from this momentous day that began the history of the city of St. Petersburg.
St. Petersburg was named not after Tsar Peter Alexeyevich, but after his patron saint, the Apostle Peter. The Tsar himself called the city a paradise in his personal correspondence. The nickname Peter, familiar to us today, appeared already in the 18th century and was first mentioned in von Visen's comedy, The Miner. Throughout its history, the city has changed its name 3 times. In 1914, at the beginning of World War I, and amid much anti-German sentiment, St. Petersburg was Russified to Petrograd. Later, in 1924, after Lenin's death, it was renamed to Leningrad. The historic name St. Petersburg was only returned to the city much later, in 1991.
The very first inhabitants of the not yet built city were its builders. Soldiers who had been transferred from neighboring fortresses began the work. Then peasants from surrounding villages, workers, captured Swedes and Tatars. They were all brought to the Neva in organized groups, and for the heaviest work, they brought in convicts. Now, criminals were sent to build St. Petersburg instead of to Siberia. Workers were initially housed in camps, which were temporary settlements of dugouts and huts. As for the convicts, they were housed in the guarded convict yard, which is now the site of Labor Square. Mass forced labor was used only in the first years. Later construction mainly employed hired workers as well as craftsmen, for whom log houses were built. They worked in shifts, 12 to 15 hours per shift, and were on rotation for 2 to 3 months. Wages were exactly 1 ruble per month, while the monthly subsistence minimum was 17 kopecks. Working and living conditions were harsh: constant cold, dampness, unsanitary conditions, and poor nutrition. According to rough estimates, at least 100,000 workers died from disease and exhaustion during the construction of St. Petersburg. Peter didn't think long about who to put in charge of this construction.
All right.
Danovich had more than enough zeal for 10 men or even more.
Your zeal is enough for
He
10
never
men.
asked for favors.
Yes,
Never
that's the
cited
way,
circumstances.
You'll get it all
with an
done.
iron grip on
But not
everything.
tomorrow.
Impossible orders
Today.
simply didn't exist for
Well
him.
then, what do you say, Pyotr
Well
Alexeyevich?
done.
Upon appointing Menchikov as Governor General
Well
of the
done, well
future
done.
city, the sovereign
Look.
had no doubt
They've brought fresh timber.
he'll definitely pull it off.
The best quality.
Alexander Danilovich Menchikov came from a humble family. According to one version, he was the son of a groom. According to another, a baker. From age 14, he served in the Tsar's toy regiment, where he quickly won Peter's trust, became his valet, and then became his closest companion and one of the leading figures of the state. The Tsar called him Aleksashka, my dear friend, brother and son of my heart. During the Northern War with Sweden, Menchikov commanded large forces of infantry and cavalry, while remaining Governor General of St. Petersburg.
Building any structure in Petersburg required dozens of times more effort than building a structure anywhere in the rest of Russia. The marshy soil was drained by hand, and they dug canals to divert water. The excavated soil was used to fill the lowlands. For the foundation, it was necessary to reinforce the soil with piles, and the piles had to be driven into frozen ground so that they wouldn't float away.
The shifting ground and the vast abundance of water would create problems throughout Petersburg's entire history. Water seeped to the surface, undermined foundations, and washed away cemeteries. Constant dampness contributed to the development of tuberculosis and an abundance of lice. Building the subway in the city on the Neva has always been fraught with great difficulties due to the complex soil conditions. A powerful quicksand, which is a section of liquefied soil, caused tunnel erosion and flooding twice, both in 1974 and in 1995. The consequences were finally eliminated, but only much later, in 2004.
Initially, St. Petersburg was called a naval headquarters, and Peter's stay there was designated in documents as a campaign. Wading ankle-deep in mud under fierce northern winds, the Tsar scrutinized every detail. He checked what he saw against the blueprints. At the sight of the slightest mistake, he would curse so violently that even the seasoned Menchikov's heart sank into his boots.
Troika?
Despite all the difficulties, by the autumn of the year 1703, in a fantastically short time, The Peter and Paul Fortress was erected on Hare Island, which is now the historical center of the city and one of its most recognizable symbols.
The Peter and Paul Fortress was built according to a joint design that was created by Tsar Peter and French engineer Lambert de Guerin. Initially, it had wooden fortifications and earthen embankments. In the year 1706, they began rebuilding the bastions in stone. However, the fortress became fully granite only by the end of the 18th century.
Since 1725, the Peter and Paul Cathedral became the burial vault of the Romanovs. Here rest the bodies of all emperors and members of their families, from Peter the Great to the presumed remains of Nicholas II. With the exception of Ivan VI Antonovich and Emperor Peter II. It housed the secret chancellery, which was a body for political investigation. And in the fortress casemates was arranged a prison, where important state criminals were held. Upon returning to Moscow, Peter hastened to share his extreme joy with Martha Catherine. The Tsar had met her a year ago at Menchikov's house, where the widow of a Swedish officer served as housekeeper. And now, he could not imagine life without her. Sparing no detail, Peter painted for his beloved the miracle city that was growing in the midst of Finnish swamps, while she gratefully listened to his every word. The emperor blossomed in her arms. Here she is, his kindred spirit. The construction of Petersburg proceeded at a rapid pace. A battery was built on the spit of Vasilyevsky Island. On the left bank of the Neva, the Admiralty shipyard was laid out, and also a galley fleet was being created. But all this was happening essentially on the territory of a hostile state. Only in the year 1721, after the Peace of Nystad, would the Baltic lands, including Petersburg, be officially annexed to Russia. Meanwhile, the Northern War was in full swing, and the Swedish fleet had blockaded the mouth of the Neva from the sea. No ship would be able to break through to St. Petersburg. The city from which Peter intended to trade with all of Europe found itself in complete isolation, and few people even knew about it. All of this is in vain. Nobody needs this city. I'm so sick of everything. I could hang myself. At the wharf bobbed a merchant ship that was flying an English flag. A miracle! The English captain was puzzled. He had been carrying salt and wine to the trading city of Nynstadt, but he had arrived in some St. Petersburg. Would they perhaps give a good price here? Alexander Danilovich, in his joy, presented him with a reward: 500 gold pieces for himself and 10 thalers for each sailor. Menchikov rushed to write to the Tsar. If merchants are so very eager to come here, despite all the Swedish schemes, it means the city will soon resound throughout Europe. Peter, upon receiving this news, was so delighted that he ran to boast to his dear Catherine.
You see,
he ordered that Russian merchants should be informed that they could bring their goods to St. Petersburg
tell our merchants to
for
start
export
exporting
trade.
goods. You see, we'll all work out.
However, merchants stubbornly traveled to Arkhangelsk, where the English and Dutch arrived by sea. Everything had been established there for centuries. Convenient roads from central Russia to Arkhangelsk were laid out, with inns and warehouses. Then Peter issued a decree ordering the most popular goods to be shipped not to Arkhangelsk but to St. Petersburg. The overland roads leading to the Baltic were completely unsuitable for trade caravans consisting of heavily loaded wagons. A traveler heading to St. Petersburg in the autumn or spring could count several dozen horses that had drowned in the swamp. and which were still in their harnesses. Those goods that did make it to the city on the Neva, they rotted in the warehouses of Trinity Wharf, simply because there was no one to sell them to. Foreign ships could not break through the Swedish blockade.
In 7 years, between the years 1703 and 1710, only 3 ships reached St. Petersburg. Only after the Treaty of Nystad in the year 1721 would foreign ships come to St. Petersburg, and they would come in such numbers that Trinity Wharf would not have enough space for mooring.
Meanwhile, due to the closure of Arkhangelsk, Dutch merchants suffered enormous losses, and the question of breaking off trade relations with Russia arose. Then Peter partially restored trade to Arkhangelsk, setting quotas for the most popular goods in a 2-to-1 ratio in favor of St. Petersburg. But within just a few years, the quotas had to be revised yet again in favor of Arkhangelsk. During these years, many Russian merchants went bankrupt, and export trade continued to drain raw materials from the country at dumping prices. Peter did not despair. He knew there's a time for everything. He was building St. Petersburg not for immediate gains. As a Tsar, he was building it for the empire, and as a father, for his children. Sadly, his and Catherine's first daughter died at the age of 1, but their second daughter, Anna, was growing up, and right after the Poltava victory, Elizabeth was born too. Peter increasingly thought about making Catherine his lawful wife. His feelings for her had not cooled over the years. And besides, it was improper for the Tsar's daughters to grow up out of wedlock. But he postponed the wedding. The situation was wartime, and there was an enormous amount of work to do. The sovereign spent more and more time on the banks of the Neva. He personally participated in shipbuilding, affectionately calling the ships his babies. His favorite ship was the 16-gun snow called Lisette. The Tsar had lovingly named this ship after his youngest daughter, Elizabeth. The Admiralty was within comfortable walking distance of Peter's house, and therefore the Tsar walked to work. He officially held the position of Chief Master of the Admiralty shipyard, and he received a salary of 365 rubles per year. The Governor-General of St. Petersburg, Menchikov, worked at the shipyard too, as a shipbuilding apprentice. And he earned 182 rubles per year for his work. In fact, the city of St. Petersburg was already the capital of the state. But the state apparatus moved from Moscow slowly. Government departments opened their branches in St. Petersburg. They were known as field chancelleries. But their heads were near Peter, in the new capital. Thus, the Moscow departments themselves became branches, while the field chancelleries became collegia. Only in the year 1712 did the governing Senate move from Moscow. From that time on, Peter's stay in St. Petersburg was no longer called a campaign in documents. St. Petersburg officially became the capital.
Since the time of Peter I, the country had 2 main cities: Moscow, or the First Throne, where emperors were crowned, and St. Petersburg, the official capital, where the court and central government institutions were located. Peter II moved the capital to Moscow, but his successor, Anna Ioannovna, brought everything back full circle. St. Petersburg remained the capital of the empire for more than 180 years. On March 5th of the year 1918, due to the German front approaching Petrograd, Lenin's government of the Russian Soviet Republic moved to Moscow, and it has remained Russia's capital ever since.
It was in Moscow that Sovereign Peter Alexeyevich organized celebrations for the Poltava victory. In January of the year 1710, thousands of captured Swedes were paraded through the streets of the First Throne city. Then came a report that among the prisoners, an officer had appeared who called himself Johann Kruse, and he claimed to be the husband of Martha Skavronskaya, the Tsar's Catherine, and he also told everyone about his wife, who was now bearing children for the Russian Tsar. It was as if Peter's support had been knocked out from under his feet. Even an autocrat cannot marry a married woman. The Tsar ordered an investigation. Soon it was confirmed that the real Johann Cruz had actually died. Menchikov proposed that they hang the impostor. Peter decided to spare him. And in order to discourage other people from talking, he sent him to Siberia to be permanently exiled. He himself returned to the north, to the place where the war with the Swedes continued, and the new city was being populated. The first generation of the capital's residents consisted of service people, from field marshal to private, and clerks, that is, officials, as well as craftsmen and workers who were brought in to build the city. About a third of the population consisted of soldiers from the capital's garrison. There were many foreigners, both mercenaries and prisoners, Swedes and Tatars. By Peter's decree, stone construction was banned throughout the country and was carried out only in St. Petersburg, and stonemasons were transferred here as well. Both limestone and granite were brought from any and all available quarries. In addition, anyone entering the city had to pay a stone tax, 3 stones per cart, each weighing at least 2 kilograms, and 10 to 30 stones from each ship. But there still wasn't enough stone. Peter wanted his paradise to become a proper European city, and he therefore invited experienced urban planners to help out with its planning. One of the first to arrive in Russia was Domenico Andrea Trazzini from Lugano, Switzerland. Trazzini was a specialist in both military and civil architecture. He developed the street layout, authored standard house designs, and he also designed cathedrals, palaces, and other city buildings.
Here it is, Peter Alexeyevich.
Architect Trazzini didn't disappoint.
A house in the Italian style.
Peter Alexeyevich,
When I first saw it
when he
myself,
saw the palace in the Italian style,
Look at the windows.
couldn't believe his eyes.
Big windows.
He
solid
rejoiced
panes,
like a child,
lots of
touching
light.
everything with his hands.
And inside,
on the walls were tapestries,
inside,
mirrors,
Peter Alexeyevich.
Italian furniture,
Tapestries on the walls,
large
mirrors.
windows
I'll
with
bring in
solid
foreign
glass
furniture,
panes.
crystal, gold.
And then, as if on cue, the cannons thundered. The Swedes! And that ended the palace tour. Alexander Danilovich did not get to show off to his heart's content. What a disaster it was, a mess everywhere. The threat of Swedish naval attack persisted throughout the years of the Great Northern War. To protect St. Petersburg from the sea, in the year 1704, Fort Kronstadt, which translated from German as Crown Castle, was built on a shoal near Kotlin Island. The fort completely controlled the shipping channel, and throughout Kronstadt's entire history, not a single enemy ship passed by it. In the year of 1723, near the fort on Kotlin Island, Peter founded the fortress and city of Kronstadt. This fortress city would later become the main naval base of the Baltic Fleet.
Unfortunately, St. Petersburg's location made it extremely vulnerable under Catherine II during the war with Sweden in 1788. Cannon volleys shook the windows of the Winter Palace, and the smell of gunpowder smoke filled the streets. During World War I, in March of the year 1918, German troops came so uncomfortably close that they began the artillery bombardment of Petrograd. In 1941, Wehrmacht troops were already in the 3rd month of war. They were just 40 kilometers from Leningrad, and they put it under siege. However, throughout its entire history, this city has never once been captured by an enemy.
Peter finally introduced his beloved Catherine to his family and to the entire court as his future wife. The Tsar had no time to marry immediately, He was preparing for a campaign against the Turks. Menchikov did not really believe that the sovereign with his violent temper would be tamed by his wife's hands. But it was heartening to look at the happy Tsar. Peter built his new capital according to his own tastes, so his satisfaction would be ensured. He strictly monitored that construction would only use prescribed materials, and that it followed prescribed designs. The traditional Russian layout, where the house was located in the middle of a courtyard with service buildings and vegetable gardens, was forbidden. Houses were ordered to be built along the building line and not in the middle of their courtyards. That is, all houses had to stand adjacent to each other, with facades aligned. And a small space for courtyards was allotted only behind the house. This courtyard was built up with other residential and utility structures. And over time, these structures grew taller and taller. This is how the famous St. Petersburg well courtyards came into being. The difference from Moscow can still be felt today. Muscovites are used to front gardens and small parks in courtyards, and they call the house entrance a podezd, because carriages could drive up to the entrance. Petersburgers call this paradno, because all the old houses also have a back entrance that is accessible from the courtyard. Previously, food vendors would enter through it, and they would go straight into the kitchen. Provisions in St. Petersburg were sold not on every corner, as in Moscow, but in specialized markets. Groceries and fresh products at the Mitny Dvor. Fish and meat in separate rows. The fish and meat markets, all with mandatory sanitary control. Bread was imported and dairy products were supplied by Finns who hailed from the surrounding estates. Peddlers walked around the city, each carrying a specific type of goods. Stoves with stovetops were installed in kitchens, where meat could be fried in a pan rather than baked, as had always been done before.
Here she is. I want to show you something.
Peter I loved to say,
The Narva is here.
God grant me health, and St. Petersburg
Palace will be right
the
here.
new Amsterdam.
God grant
He
me
showed
health.
everything to his
Petersburg will
Catherine.
rise. A new
Plans,
Amsterdam.
blueprints,
Tiled roofs.
drawings.
Countless windmills. Tall
The Dutch
spires.
appearance of the cityscape came from
Network of
tiled
canals,
roofs,
shipyards,
numerous mills,
houses built in straight
tall
lines.
spires, there were about 50 of them, and many canals. The austere and monumental architectural appearance of St. Petersburg that we know today was formed mainly in the 19th century, during the era of Nicholas I, who transformed the capital in many ways. Palace Square with the Alexander Column. Senate Square with the Bronze Horseman. The spit of Vasilyevsky Island with the rostral columns. St. Isaac's and Kazan cathedrals. The capital was transformed into a grandiose architectural ensemble in the classical style. Originally, the city was built in the restrained style of so-called Petrine Baroque, and it was designed to be viewed from the water. Peter dreamed of transforming small sailing vessels into the main form of transportation within the city. A private shipyard was available for both their construction and their maintenance. Peter distributed small vessels to the city's residents, and he required them to participate in water assemblies once a week. Just think, St. Petersburg, which is famous for its bridges, and they were deliberately not built during Peter's reign. The only exception was floating bridges or pontoons, as well as drawbridges, only in the most essential locations. In addition, permanent boat crossings were strictly and completely prohibited. This way, the Tsar tried to accustom residents to travel by water. But the plan failed. For several months, the Neva was covered with ice, and during ice drift, the bridgeless islands lost any and all communication. They also had to abandon the original layout of Vasilyevsky Island, where streets were to be replaced by a network of parallel canals, lines that would be intersected by avenues. However, the streets retained the name lines. There are many bridges in St. Petersburg, and most of them, as in Peter's time, are drawbridges in order not to interfere with ship passage. Finally, an event that had been awaited for years took place in the new capital. Sovereign Peter Alexeyevich married his dearly beloved. She converted to Orthodoxy and went by the name Catherine Mikhailovna. Anna and Elizabeth, both born out of wedlock, at long last acquired royal status. But according to the law of that time, the right to the throne passed through the male line. The sovereign did not give up hope for the birth of a son, to whom he could pass on without hesitation everything he had achieved during his years of reign. And that is why marriage to Catherine was especially important to Peter. So,
avenue lines will
what had
run
recently
perpendicular,
seemed like
here
bold
and here.
fantasies was finally becoming reality. The city founded by Peter grew and filled with ever
This
more
part is
new
already
inhabitants.
built. Why not?
Unfortunately, along with it, grew the number of concerns that fell on the Governor-General's
All right
shoulders.
then.
Menchikov
Parallel
oversaw
canals
the
with
improvement
streets
of the
intersecting
capital,
them. We'll call those
cleaning
streets
the
lines.
canals around the
Main road
Admiralty,
will go right through here.
reinforcing
from
the banks of the
Admiralty and
Neva,
beyond.
Very good.
and laying roads. Seeing how the northern capital was being transformed, the sovereign's
You
mood
did
brightened.
everything right. Well done,
And he was
good.
very
Alexei.
Thank
generous
you.
with rewards for Alexander Danilovich. The main entrance road to St. Petersburg became the so-called Nevsky Proseka, from the Alexander Nevsky Monastery to the Admiralty. The perfectly straight road was laid through forest and swamps, by monks of the monastery as well as Swedish prisoners, paved with stone, with 4 rows of birch trees planted along the roadsides. Later, the Proseka became known as Perspective. And then from 1781, it became known as Nevsky Prospect.
Nevsky Prospect is a whole 4.5 kilometers long, which is almost 3 times longer than Tverskaya. And for a very long time, it remained the longest street in Russia. Nevsky Prospect was the very first place in the country to receive street lighting, which consisted of oil lamps with benches placed beneath them. In the 19th century, Nevsky was built up in the style of high classicism, and it became a unique ensemble avenue, the grand facade of the empire. The Soviet authorities renamed it to October 25th Avenue, but a quarter of a century later, on January 13th, 1944, the exact day before the operation to lift the blockade began, the historical name was restored. Modern Nevsky Prospect, St. Petersburg's main street, is part of the highway connecting the two capitals, from Red Square to Palace Square, and it is the only street in Russia that, in clear weather, can be seen in its entirety for several kilometers.
St. Petersburg's streets were paved with wood. Wooden planks were laid over logs. The embankments were built on piles, and each pile had wooden planking laid on top. They would be clad in granite only in the second half of the 18th century. And under Peter, the only stone embankment was in front of his summer palace. The construction and maintenance of embankments, as well as pavements and street oil lamps, was the exclusive responsibility of property owners. In addition, everyone had to plant linden trees in front of their house. This is how the greening of St. Petersburg began. In the summer garden, ancient statues were exhibited for public viewing. They were mostly copies, but there were also originals, including the Taurid Venus. Visitors were admitted to the garden in decent clothing only, and all statues and sculptural fountain groups were provided with explanatory plaques. During major holidays, the garden was illuminated, and tables with refreshments were set up, while soldiers carried buckets of vodka along the pathways. Since he was growing tired of military and state affairs, Peter found a new outlet for himself. By personal order of the Tsar, plants from other climatic zones began to be planted in St. Petersburg: lindens, chestnuts, even grapes and cotton, which did not take root well in open ground and froze to death. Peter devoted himself to this passion with fervor, and he started spending less and less time with Catherine. She tried to attract her husband's attention. She sighed meaningfully. She asked leading questions, Finally, she would go off to her rooms in hurt. But the sovereign seemed not to notice. The center of urban and commercial life became the square by Trinity Church, near the wharf of the same name. There, in front of the long building of the Collegia, imperial decrees were announced. And at the trading rows, bids and contracts were announced. Military parades were held on the square during holidays, in which Peter himself invariably participated in his Preobrazhensky regiment uniform. And afterwards, he feasted noisily at the Tavern of the Four Frigates. After each toast, the cannons of ships moored at the wharf fired salutes that made the walls of the surrounding buildings tremble. In the Collegia, window repair was a separate expense item. The window repair was recorded in the expense book as follows, from which during victories and by weather the glass was broken out. The entire city was like his vast estate, where he ruled at his own discretion. And he consistently interfered not only in the professional, but also in the personal lives of his subjects. By order of the Senate, the main police chancellery was formally established. Under the police chief's command were allocated 10 officers, 20 non-commissioned officers, and 160 good soldiers. The police's powers were extensive. They monitored everything, from the layout and appearance of houses to the condition of cesspools. For throwing filth and garbage into the street, the whip and hard labor. And for selling stale vegetables and dead animals at the market, also the whip and hard labor. Merchants' scales had to bear an official stamp. Fake scales carried a heavy fine. Homeowners were required to inspect the pavement in front of their houses every single day, and to repair it in a timely manner as needed. Furthermore, the fire service was also under the police chief's jurisdiction. Besides the fire brigade with its pumping engine, a system for fire alerts and firefighting was created. Citizens had to rush to the signal with axes and fire hooks in order to help the firefighters. To protect against fires, it was forbidden to build private bathhouses, only public ones. Homeowners were required each and every month to clean chimney flues, coat ceilings with clay, and monitor the condition of fire ponds. Bread was allowed to be baked only on Thursdays and Sundays, and only if there was no heat or wind. At night, a patrol team led by a sniffer, Warrant Officer Strukov, went around and literally sniffed out those who were secretly baking bread or heating bathhouses. A permanent curfew was in effect, from 10 p.m. in summer and from 8 p.m. in winter. Only military personnel and midwives with special documents could move around the city at night.
The financing of the grand construction project, like the reforms and wars, came from tax increases. Peasants paid 74 kopecks for each male subject. In contrast, townspeople paid 1 ruble and 20 kopecks. The taxpayer rolls now included those who had never paid taxes before, peasants of the north and Siberia, residents of ethnic borderlands and the Volga region. Amazingly, the revenue side of the budget tripled. The army consumed about 3 million a year. And in St. Petersburg, the budget of the city chancellery alone amounted to 162,500 rubles in the year 1722.
Peter Alexeyevich tossed a letter to Danilich. One of the royal relatives complained that the roof of her palace was leaking, so that during rainy weather, it was impossible to find a place to take shelter. Alexander Danilovich was quite surprised. To trouble His Royal Majesty over such trifles? Trifles, you say? I have a whole storehouse full of such trifles.
What's this?
What do you say, Danilich?
Speak! Speak!
Slander, Your
Menchikov
Majesty.
wheezed.
Trifles,
Slander,
you
Your
say?
Majesty. Envious people. I have an account for every kopeck.
Confess.
But the prince
These are
had
people.
his sins.
Speak.
He seized
I wanna
lands
hear
and
it.
villages
What
from
do you say,
landowners.
Danilich?
He appropriated
Trifles.
estates that had passed
Get
to the
outta here.
state.
Envious
He
trifles
sheltered
to you, maybe.
religious
I'll show you
dissidents
what
and
trifles
runaway
are.
peasants, charging them fees for
It wasn't
living on
me.
his lands. Peter even lost sleep over it. If Menchikov, showered with honors and bounties, doesn't hesitate to line his pockets at the state's expense, then who can be trusted now? Embezzlement and corruption in Peter's time sometimes reached unprecedented proportions. Out of every 100 rubles of taxes collected, at best only 30 reached the treasury. Many were stealing, and far from all could be caught red-handed. Peter established the Fiscal Service, a specialized supervisory body. Its main task was to prevent damage to the treasury and abuses by high officials. At the head of the service was the chief fiscal, who answered only to the Tsar. Chief Fiscal Alexei Nestorov had long been sizing up the all-powerful Menchikov, but his reach was too short. So he began investigating the abuses of Prince Matvei Gagarin, the Siberian Governor-General, who was rumored to be protected by His Serene Highness. Hundreds of onlookers froze in anticipation of the execution. The drumbeat fell silent. Prince Gagarin cast a heavy gaze over the crowd. Not long ago, he boasted of unheard-of riches, built luxurious mansions, and he even was known to throw feasts with 50 courses. But he was destined to die a pauper. Everything he had acquired passed to the treasury by the Tsar's verdict. His wife burst into loud sobs. Peter looked sternly at Alexander Danilovich. Was the hint, he seemed to say, well understood?
Confess! These are people! Speak!
Menchikov, though he fell from grace, avoided arrest.
What's the matter with you, Petrusha?
An old friend, Catherine Alexeyevna, almost always took the prince's side. Many years ago, he had pulled her out of poverty and taken her under his protection. And now she was returning the favor to Alexander Danilovich, protecting him from fits of the Tsar's anger. Peter loved Catherine, and this love saved Menchikov for the time being. In the year 1721, St. Petersburg celebrated the Treaty of Nystad. The Great Northern War ended in complete victory for Russia. In Trinity Cathedral, the senators bestowed upon Peter the title of Emperor and Father of the Fatherland. When he stepped onto the square, he was enthusiastically greeted by a huge crowd. St. Petersburg would henceforth become not just a capital, but the capital of an empire. The festivities continued uninterrupted for 7 days, with masquerades, balls, illuminations, and fireworks. And Catherine also became empress. Peter personally placed a crown on her head. It was the first crown in the entire history of the Russian Empire. The festivities of the Petrine era were lavish, noisy, and lengthy, and participation in them was mandatory for everyone. The police saw to that. Masquerade participants were forbidden to remove their masks or change costumes until the celebration ended. In the squares stood roasted bull carcasses, and liquor was poured from tubs and barrels for anyone who wanted it. Warships shook the shores with cannon salutes. At night, fireworks and firecrackers soared into the sky. All of these celebrations followed a very precisely written script, and the decorations used an elaborate system of allegories. For example, a flaming heart depicted the Tsar's heartfelt attachment to St. Petersburg. On November 5th of the year 1721, exactly 1 week after the Treaty of Nystad celebrations ended, all the decorations were washed away. Another flood occurred.
Major flooding in the Neva Delta occurred almost every autumn and every spring. If the water rose between 1.5 to 2 meters or more above the normal levels, the flood became known as a natural disaster. Cannon shots fired from the Peter and Paul Fortress served to warn people of extremely dangerous water levels. The flood of 1777 virtually destroyed the summer garden, and it flooded the cellars of the Peter and Paul Fortress, disastrously claiming the lives of several hundred people. The flood of 1824 is described in depth in the poet Pushkin's work, which is entitled The Bronze Horseman. The streets turned into canals where galleys sailed in, rescuing people who were drowning. The flood of 1924 was particularly powerful, and people said it was divine punishment from above for renaming the city of St. Petersburg to Leningrad. Only in the year 2011 was the dam construction completed, finally giving the city the ability to protect itself from natural disasters.
Alexander Danilovich watched as water flooded the embankments, and logs carried by the waves crashed against windows and house walls. But what did St. Petersburg matter to him now? After yet another denunciation, the sovereign's patience snapped, and he dismissed Menchikov from his position as Governor General. The prince understood. This was only the beginning. Wasn't the fate of Matvei Gagarin now awaiting him? But in those days, Peter was preoccupied with something else. He had received news that struck him right in the heart. Catherine had betrayed him. But most importantly, with whom? Chamberlain Mons, the brother of Anna Mons, who had once been Peter's own lover. It seemed that fate was cruelly mocking the Russian emperor. Mons was accused of bribery, and he was sentenced to beheading. In the margins of the document, Peter wrote, "Carry out the sentence." He no longer spoke to Catherine. He didn't want to see his friend Sashka. Perhaps he didn't want to live anymore. With a heavy heart, the sovereign was returning by water to St. Petersburg after inspecting the Ladoga Canal. Along the way, he saw a boat with soldiers stranded on a sandbar, being overwhelmed by waves. The emperor rushed to their rescue. While saving human lives, Peter fought to the very end, as if he were trying to overcome the raging elements on his own. But this heroic act had fatal consequences. After several hours spent in cold water, his chronic illness worsened. And although Peter realized that his days were now numbered, there was no regret in his soul. He had lived a glorious life, full of heroic deeds and achievements, accomplishments that others could only dream of. He loved, and he was loved. He had good and loyal friends. He knew the joy of victory and the bitterness of defeat. Fate had given him the oh-so-rare happiness of seeing his boldest dreams become reality. He gave himself completely to life, and he generously shared his boundless energy with those around him. And when he met resistance and misunderstanding, well, then he could be fierce and ruthless even to his loved ones. Yes, he spared neither himself nor others, but in return he created a great army and navy, transformed the Muscovite kingdom into a European power, and built a magnificent city of dreams on the site of deadly swamps. And yet doubts persisted. Who would continue his work? His eldest son, Alexe, was accused of high treason, and he died before the sentence could be carried out. The younger one, Peter, died before reaching the age of 5. There remained 2 beloved daughters and his wife. Before his death, the emperor intended to name his heir, but his final wishes remained a mystery. Peter Alexeyevich was fading rapidly, and with him, an entire era was coming to an end. But what he achieved forever transformed the history of the Russian state.